Welcome to Gary Clarke Tech. This is a crash course on the API platform. The goal of this course is to get you to such a level of understanding that you're able to start creating your own APIs quickly. So what is the API platform and why should me and you use it? It's a framework which is dedicated to API-driven or Jamstack projects. It's open source and it's written in PHP at its core, and so that's the language that me and you are going to be programming in this course. It supports industry-leading standards such as JSON-LD, Hydra and Open API. If those names don't mean anything to you at the moment, that's fine. All will be explained as the course progresses. Its distribution includes a Symfony framework, so you get to benefit from well-known components. If you haven't used it before, I think you'd be quite surprised at just how quickly we get up and running with a working API. So let's get started. Installation. There are two ways to install this. There's a Docker installation, which actually, according to the documentation, is the recommended way of installing this. However, we're not going to do that. We're actually going to do a Symfony install first and then install the API project on top of our Symfony framework installation. The reason why I'm doing that is because not all of the students that follow my channel actually use Docker or are comfortable with Docker, and if things go wrong with Docker then we'll end up getting sidetracked and dealing with other things. I just wanted to stay focused on the API platform, which you can do by installing it the way that we're going to do it. So that's going to be using Composer. Here is the command: Composer create project, and then it's Symfony/skeleton, and then I'm calling mine products API. So the API we're going to build is going to be like a manufacturer and products thing. And so let's actually go and run this in our terminal. I'll just bump up this font here a bit. I'll paste that in there, and so that should go and create me a Symfony skeleton project. So we're not done yet. On top of that, we're going to need to require the API project. So first off, let's cd into that. So cd products API, and then I'm going to composer require API. Okay, so this is using Symfony Flex. That's why it's able to just say require API, and it doesn't have to say API project API or anything like that. If you've watched any of my other Symfony videos, then Symfony Flex is explained in those. So composer require API. This will go and get API platform API pack. I think that's what it's called. Yep. Okay, and then it'll ask you some questions. So it's saying, do you want to include Docker configuration from recipes? And I'm just going to click X, which means no permanently. Don't ask or never ask again for this project, because we don't need that. This is just a learning project. Okay, and it's just going to finish off its installation now. I'm now going to go and open that project in PHP Storm. So open. Okay, and so here we are. We have a Symfony project with the API platform installed inside of that project. Let's go and look at our Composer JSON file, and so here you should see everything should look the same for you as what it does for me. So we have API platform core there has been installed. The only change I've made to this is I've actually created a little notes file, which was the notes that you saw on my screen. First thing I'm going to do is configure my database. So I'm using MySQL, which is my local installation. However, if you're using Postgres or something else, some other relational database, that's fine. To follow this tutorial, that will work just fine also. So what we need to do is go over to our .env file, which is this one here, and it's in the project root. If we go and have a look at this here, you should see a database URL already in here. I'm just going to replace it with the one we've got here. And so let me talk you through this. I'm using MySQL. The user is called root. I'm not specifying a password. This is my host, so localhost, port 3306, and the database will be called products API. That database hasn't been created yet. That's going to be the next step actually. So let's go and grab this command here, which is bin console doctrine database create. So when we installed everything there, we've installed doctrine ORM, which means we can run doctrine commands, and under the hood for persistence, for persisting our resources, we're actually going to be using doctrine. Okay, let's go and run this. And it's telling me created database products API. Let's go and check that to make sure that that has actually happened. So I'm using a tool called Table Plus. You use whatever you want. what do we call it? Products API. So let's have a look. Products API. Let's open this. Okay, and here we have a Products API database. As you can see, we don't have any tables yet or anything like that. We have literally an empty database. And then this final setup step is to actually just start up a local server. And so grab this command here, we'll paste that in there, which is php-uppercase S localhost colon 8000, and we're saying that directory that we want to serve it from is our public directory. So let's hit this and we'll go and grab this, paste it into the browser, and then what we need to append onto there if we're using the composer install is /API, hit go. And so what you should see is this, and believe it or not, this is actually a user interface where we can interact with our products API. At the moment we don't actually have anything that we can interact with because we haven't created any resources. So what you will see is this, not operations defined in the spec. But what we're going to do in the next one is we're actually going to start creating resources, and then we'll be able to interact with our API properly. Now that we have everything set up, let's actually start creating a basic API. In order to do that, it's very simple. All we need to do is design a public data model, and the API platform will use the public data model classes in order to expose and document a web API. So what does that mean in real life? Let's go and make a start on that now, and you'll see, or you'll soon see exactly what I mean by that. Before we do that, we're just actually going to stop the local web server that we started, and we're going to actually serve it using the Symfony binary, because I found that when I was practicing with this project, things worked better when I did it that way. So stop the server, so I can do that with Control-C. And then you're going to need the Symfony binary for this. If you don't already have it installed, you can get it from this address. It's a very simple download, and then you'll just have it installed. And so it's got instructions for Linux, Mac OS and Windows. And if you want to know what it does, it says that the Symfony binary is an open source project and it provides these things here. The best way to create new Symfony applications, a powerful local web server, a tool to check for security vulnerabilities, and seamless integration with platform.sh. So that's what we're going to be using. I've already got it installed, and so now what I'm going to do is actually going to start a server again, except I'm going to use this command here, which is symfony serve-d. I'll paste that in there, hit go, and then this time it's going to serve it with HTTPS. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to a new browser tab. I drop that in there again, I append on API. Okay, and we're back to where we were. So what we need to do now is actually go and create public data models. Before we do that, let me just show you where we should create these. So if you go over to config, which should be your second folder down, and then packages, and you'll see a file called API platform.yaml, API_platform.yaml. So these are all your configuration files, and this is the one which is specific for the API platform. And if you look at this, you'll see a mapping here, and it says paths, project directory, source, entity. So this is where we need to create our public data models. If you're familiar with the Symfony framework, or you've used Symfony before, then this is where you create entities which are your public data models. And so that's what we're going to do. So we need to go to source, entity, and in here we're just going to create an initial, just a PHP class, and we're going to call it manufacturer. So don't start getting ahead of ourselves and thinking in terms of entities. We're not actually going to make this an entity yet. We're just going to create a plain old PHP object. Okay, let's take this one step at a time so all of the steps will make sense. So what I'm going to do is actually just going to add a comment here and say a manufacturer, and then what we'll do is give this a ID, which can be an integer or null, and we'll initialize it as null. And so if we go back over to the browser and refresh this, we shouldn't see any changes, so we still have the same thing. However, if we actually go and mark this as a resource, which we can do like this, we are marking it as an API resource. If we go back to the browser and refresh now, And believe it or not, we now have a working API. If you look here, we have typical API operations such as get, post, get for individual items such as individual manufacturers, put, delete and patch. And if we scroll down here, you can see we have the schemas for our resources. So we have a manufacturer. At the moment we just have one field on there which is an ID, and it was actually set to private, so that won't show up. But let's go over and actually create some fields which will show up. So if we say public string name, I'm just going to set it to an empty string, and for each of the fields, if we add comments, it will actually show up in our schema on the tool there. So what we'll say here is the ID of the manufacturer, and here we'll just say the name of the manufacturer. Okay, so let's go back to the browser and let's refresh this. And so this time, if we look at the schema, we can see that we have a name which is visible to us, and it says the name of the manufacturer. If I was to set that to private and we go back and refresh, then it's no longer visible. So it has to be public, or it needs to be publicly accessible. So how do we make a private property publicly accessible? Just think of it like programming in PHP, object-oriented PHP. All we'd need to do was actually just create a getter for the name, and so the name can be accessed. If we go back and refresh, okay, so now you'll see that we have a name, but notice here it says read only equals true. So that means that we'd only be able to read the name of manufacturers when they come back from the database. We won't actually be able to set them. For example, if we wanted to create a new manufacturer at the moment, we won't actually be able to set the name. So how do we actually make it not read only? How do you make it so it's writable as well? Again, just think in terms of PHP. All we need to do is just create a setter for this. Let's go back to the browser, refresh. Okay, and now you notice that the read-only marker has gone. We can now read and write to the name field of a manufacturer. This is fairly basic at the moment, so behind the scenes what I'm going to do is just going to add 3 or 4 more fields, and it will give us a better example to work with. And so this is what I've come up with, nothing too extravagant. What I've added is a description, I've added a country code, both of those are going to be strings, and I've added a date time interface, which means it can be a date time or date time immutable, and that is just a listed date. And you'll notice that I've just put little comments here, because that is what you see when you look at the schema here, for example, where we see the name of the manufacturer, this little explanation there. That basically comes from these comments which we put above the properties, so quite useful to you. Let's go ahead and add getters and setters for our new fields. So I'm just going to use PHP Storm, which will do some of this for me. And I'm just going to add them for description, country code and listed date, because ID is something which will be set by the database, and it's not something that we're going to need. I'll go back over to the browser and I'll give this a refresh, and so we should see the new fields in the schema. So if we have a look down here, and so they're listed with the types, so string for the names, and for the date it says string and then date time, and it also tells you if things are nullable or not. So that's all pretty good. We now have a working API. However, there's something missing, because we don't actually have any way, even though we have a database, there's no way of persisting this yet. So what we're going to do in the next one is we're going to look at our manufacturer class here, and we're actually going to turn it into a doctrine entity using annotations, and then that way we'll be able to actually add manufacturers to the database by using the post operation, and we'll also be able to retrieve manufacturers as a collection, and we'll be able to retrieve individual manufacturers using their identifiers. So we'll do that next. So this is where we've left off. We're able to see a visual representation of our API. If you're wondering what this is, this styling and where it comes from, it's actually the Swagger UI. If we go over to the Swagger website and then if we look under Tools, you can click Swagger UI and this should start looking familiar to it. Let's try this live demo. Okay, so as you can see, the styling and everything looks quite familiar to you, and as you could see there, it's something which you can actually download. So what has happened is the guys that have put together the API platform have actually incorporated Swagger UI into it, which makes a nice touch, and it makes it easy for us to actually visually see how our API works, what operations we have available to us, what resources, etc. And so how does it get the information? Where's the information coming from in order for it to display this? Well, it's coming from something called an Open API document, which is a specification. We'll go to the site and actually that'll be able to tell you better than how I could describe it. So it says the Open API specification defines a standard language agnostic interface to HTTP APIs, which allows both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of the service without access to the source code, etc., etc., etc. So it's a standardization of a standard way of formatting API documentation in ways that all different systems can understand and can all understand it the same way. Back to the task in hand, and that is fetching and saving data. And so data providers and persisters are provided for Doctrine ORM, and that's what we're going to use. So Doctrine ORM is an object relational mapper. What it does is it uses objects to represent database tables, and so the properties on those objects represent the fields in the database. And so by using annotations, we'll be able to go and mark up our manufacturer class and actually tell Doctrine, okay, create me a manufacturer table with this, create a auto-incrementing ID for this property here for the ID. The first thing we shall do is add a use statement at the top. So use Doctrine ORM mapping as ORM, and then with one simple step we can actually mark this as an entity, which is done like so. This manufacturer class has now become a Doctrine entity with that one simple step. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a similar thing for each of the properties, and we're going to tell Doctrine what kinds of fields these are and how they should be created in the database. And so this first one is an ID. We don't need to give it any more information than that. This next one will be a generated value or an automatically generated value, and what Doctrine will do under the hood is it will figure out how it should generate this value. So because I'm using MySQL, I'll be using an auto-incrementing ID. If I was using Postgres or Oracle, it would automatically figure out, okay, I need to be creating a sequence here. So it's really quite clever. And then what we need to do is mark this as a column, and we're going to say that the type is integer. Next we'll go and do the name, so I'm just going to drop this down here, and all I'm going to say here is column, so at ORM column, and I don't actually have to tell it the type, because what it will do is it will read this, see that it's a string, and automatically create a varchar because I'm using MySQL. This next one is similar, except I want it to hold slightly longer text, so I shall say column, so at ORM column, but this time I'm going to say type equals text, and then that will be able to hold more columns or more characters than the name field. Country code, so I just want this to be a 2-character country code, so what I'm going to do here is say column length equals 2. So it will create me a varchar type column, but the length will only be for 2 characters. In fact, it needs to be 3 characters. Nearly messed that up. Okay, the next one is a date time interface, the listed date, and so what we're going to say here is column, so at ORM column, and the type this time equals datetime. Okay, and so that is all of our properties set up. Let's just slowly scroll down them from top to bottom. So here I'm creating an auto incrementing ID, so I need to add these 3 annotations, ID, generated value, which will tell Doctrine to use auto incrementing IDs because I'm using MySQL, and then the type is integer. The next one, what it will do is we're marking it as a column, as a database column, but it will see that I'm using a string here, and so it'll automatically go and generate varchar for me. Here I need slightly more characters, so I'm saying type equals text for the description, country code. This will be a string with a length of 3 characters, and then listed date will be a type of date time. Next, I need to generate the SQL, which will create the manufacturer table in the database. I can do it with this command here. So php bin /console doctrine migrations, or doctrine : migrations : diff. What that will do is it will look at my entities, so anything which is marked as an entity, and so at the moment we only have one, which is the manufacturer. It will also look at the database, see what details are different between the two, so it will read all the annotations, and it'll see in the database that we don't actually have this existing yet, so it will just create the whole lot. And so if we go and run this, okay, so it took a while there because it needed to write a file. I'll show you where that file is. If we go up to migrations, which is underneath the project root, so it will have created this file here, version, and it should say version followed by the date, and then it'll contain a load of SQL, which behind the scenes I've just tidied up a little bit. So let's inspect this. So we're saying ID, integer, auto incrementing, not null. Name, varchar 255, not null. Description will be long text because we marked it as a text. Then country code, varchar 3, so we mark the length as 3. And then the listed date, which will be a date time. So we've generated the SQL, we now need to execute it. What we can do is we can run something similar to the last command. So where we said doctrine migrations diff, so that performed a diff, wrote the SQL for us. Now we just need to say migrate. Okay, and it'll ask you this question. It'll say you're about to execute a migration in the database products API that could result in schema changes and data loss. It's the first time we've run this. We know we're not going to break anything, and so we're happy with everything. Go and run this, and so it says it's executed. If I go over to Table Plus now and refresh this, okay, so we see 2 new tables. I'll first look at manufacturer. So as you can see, we have an ID, name, description, country code. If we look at the structure, everything is all there. This other table is doctrine migration versions, and so that is actually referring to the version files, i.e. the migration files, and it's saying which ones have been run and when they had been run also. And that way it keeps track of everything which has been created in the database when it has been created, so you can run the schemas up like we've just done there, but if we need to roll back, it just keeps everything under version control, so everything can be done in the correct sequence if you need to go back and make changes. Now that we have all that in place, we're in a fairly good position to actually go and try and create a resource using our little interface which the API platform provides for us here. So what we want to do is create a manufacturer resource. So we'll click on this one here, and you'll see this information comes up. What we want to do is try it out. Okay, and then all we need to do is just change this JSON to actually use the values which we want to actually post, which we want to create in the database. So name, we will say Acme Core, description, so a description of what the manufacturer does, and actually paste that in there. Country code, so we'll put USA, and listed date, I'm happy to just keep it as a date which has been auto-generated for us there. I'll hit execute, and so it just took a second there, but it's come back with this. And so we got an error, and it says can't get a way to read property ID in class app entity manufacturer. So I think what that's telling me is that I need to actually create a getter for the ID property. So we'll do that now. Getters ID. Okay, and so what all I've done there is just create a public get ID method in the manufacturer entity, and then what we'll do is we'll go and actually give this another try. Okay, so it seemed to take a bit longer. and it has worked this time. So 201 means that a record has been created, and it's come back with this information here. And notice that the ID is 2, so that's telling me that the first time that I ran this, it did create that record in the database, and it was only actually when it was sending back the response that it was unable to provide me with the information that I needed because there wasn't a public getter for the ID. So the first thing we'll do is we'll have a look at Table Plus, and we'll go on check out the data in there. And so as you can see, we've created 2 records for Acme Core. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete one of these, okay, because I only want the one. And then we can actually go back to our API tool, our little interface here, and we can retrieve all of the manufacturers with this endpoint here. So this retrieves the collection of manufacturer resources. If I click try it out, the collection page number, yeah, but we only have 1 record, so we'll not worry about pagination or anything like that at the moment. If I hit execute, okay, so we get a 200 response, and you should see all the information regarding our one and only manufacturer there. You may be looking at some of these bits here at context, at ID, at type. Basically, this is JSON LD format, and we'll touch on JSON LD in a later lesson, but the short version for now is that it enables auto-discoverability and ways of identifying certain resources in a standard kind of way. Finish off with one other thing. So as well as being able to retrieve all the manufacturers, you can also retrieve them individually. So here we have an endpoint API manufacturers ID. If we click on this, and we can actually enter the ID, so we know that our manufacturer has an ID of 1, and then click execute, and so it should go and get us back just a single record this time containing our one and only manufacturer. And so that has been how you persist records to the database, and how you can actually then send requests to your API in order to create records, how you can retrieve individual records, and how you can retrieve a collection of records. What we're going to do in the next one is we'll actually create another entity which will be products that belong to the manufacturer, and we can start looking at how relationships work with our API also. Up to now we've created just one type of resource, and that is the manufacturer. In this one what we're going to do is we're going to create another type of API resource, and that will be a product, and that will be related to our manufacturer with a many-to-one relationship. So we'll have many products to one manufacturer. Before we do that though, let me just tell you that in between the end of the last recording and the start of this one, I've actually created a Git repository for this, and let me just tell you about the branching strategy that we're using here. So if we look at the branches, the last recording where we created the manufacturer, that was a branch called Persisting Data, and this one that we're working on now is going to be called Related Resources. So if you want to actually go and get the code from GitHub to check mine against yours, or if you just want to download it for whatever reason, you can find it here. So it's Gary Clarke API Platform Crash Course, and if we look at the branches, you'll see here so far we just have a main branch and a persisting data branch. So I'm just trying to keep all the branches in sync with the lesson. So by the time you're watching this, you'll be able to see the new branch, hopefully, which I've forgotten what I've called it already, which is called Related Resources. So that should appear for you on GitHub as well by now. Okay, let's actually start working on creating a product resource. So we're in the entity folder again, so product API source entity. I'll just create a new PHP class. And so the reason why, or one of the reasons why we're demonstrating it like this, is so I can show you how the API platform uses IRIs, or special ways of locating related resources, which is pretty cool. So here we go, we've created a product. If you remember how we mark this as an API resource, we did it like this, API resource. So then you should see this, use API platform core annotation API resource. And so now we have 2 different kinds of resources. This doesn't have any fields yet, so let's add some fields. I'll just go ahead and quickly do this behind the scenes. We have an ID, so that's just going to be an auto incrementing ID, just like we had with manufacturer. We have something called MPN, which is manufacturer part number. So some products in the world of manufacturing, they have special unique part numbers which help identify them. The name of the product, which will be a string, the description, which will also be a string. We'll make that a long text like we did for the description of the manufacturer. The issue date, so the date which the product was issued became public, and then we'll have manufacturer, which will be our reference to our manufacturer resource, which is the manufacturer of this product. If we come over to our user interface and refresh, we now see the operations that we can perform on a product. However, at the moment it's still useless to us because we haven't marked it as a doctrine entity, so we can't actually save it to the database. And also, if we look at our product fields, because they're all private and we don't have getters and setters for these yet, it won't be actually recognized in the schema there on the user interface. So what we'll do first is we'll actually mark these as entity properties first. So what we need to do is first mark the class as an entity. Okay, so use doctrine ORM mapping as ORM, and then we shall say that this is a product and it is an entity. Next, the ID of the product. What I shall do is I shall go and borrow from manufacturer, because an auto incrementing ID, we've got all these three parts here which we need to remember, so no harm in borrowing from there, I think, rather than trying to remember. Okay, and so the next ones, we have manufacturer part number, which will be a string, so we just need to mark this as a column. And because we've indicated that it's a string, then Doctrine ORM will be able to figure this out. The name of the product, exactly the same here. So we're just going to say column, and that will default to a string. For this one, we're going to say text. So column, and then type equals text. And so that will give us a long text because we need a few more characters for the description. Date of issue of the product, so this will be a column, and we're going to say type equals date time. Okay, manufacturer of the product, so this is a little bit more complex. This isn't actually a column, this is a relationship that we're looking at here. Let me just make myself a little bit of space, and so that relationship will be a many to one. So what you do is you look at the actual entity that you're looking at the moment, which is a product. There will be many products to one manufacturer, and so you need to say what is the target entity that you're looking at here. So we say target entity equals manufacturer. Okay, great stuff. So now that we've actually created that relationship on the product, what I'm going to do is go over to the manufacturer and create an inverse relationship there. So on manufacturer, what we're going to do is create a products property, and then I'm going to say iterable products. So by saying iterable, it means it can be a iterable kind of class, such as a collection, or it can be a array. So we're going to say private iterable products, and then in the annotations here, so first off we'll say a collection of products, and then this will be the available products from this manufacturer. And as far as our doctrine entity annotations, instead of being a many to one, this time there will be one manufacturer to many products. So one to many, and then again we say the target entity, this time will be product, and then what we're going to say is mapped by, and this will be the field on our target entity which is actually mapping to this manufacturer. So if you remember what we called that, we called it manufacturer. And I'm just going to move these onto separate lines just to give myself room to do this. And we're going to add a cascading strategy. So for example, when we delete this manufacturer, what do we want to happen? We want to delete any related products so that we don't have any orphans in our database. So cascade equals persist, and we'll also say remove. And then what I'm going to do is going to go back to the product, And here we're going to do a similar thing, except instead of where we said mapped by, we'll say inversed by, and then this will be products. There's a couple more steps before we can try this out, so bear with me. Here I'm just going to let PHP Storm generate my getters and setters, and then I'll have a look at them and remove any or edit any which I think should be changed or removed. So we shall go with, we'll just grab them all, then we'll have a look what they look like, see if the names make sense, see if we actually need them. So set manufacturer, get manufacturer, okay, that's fine. Issue date, all of these are fine. What I'm just going to do is I'm not going to have set ID because that will be done by the database, but I'll keep get ID because I'll need that in order to access the ID of the product. If I go over to manufacturer, what I'm going to do here is create a constructor which initializes the products property as an array collection, an empty array collection. This products equals new array collection. Okay, that's good. Let's go and see what PHP Storm's complaining about. Property is only written but never read. Let's just remove that inspection for the time being. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go down to the bottom here, and we need getters and setters for our products. So in fact we'll just need a getter. All I want is to be able to retrieve the products for the manufacturer, and so that will do us public function get products. See what it's complaining about here. Type is duplicated by array. Let's just remove one of these. We'll remove array. Okay, that's good. The next thing I'm going to do is actually create the migration for my product, so I can do that with PHP bin console doctrine migrations diff. Let's run this. So it takes a while because it's creating a file. Let's go to migrations, and so we see that we have a new doctrine migration file here. I'll just clean it up to make it a bit easier for us to read. It's much like our manufacturer migration, except a couple of things to note here. You'll see that it's created a manufacturer ID which will hold the ID of the manufacturer, obviously, and that's how we shall reference the manufacturer which is responsible for this product. And then you'll see down at the bottom here that it's created a foreign key. So manufacturer ID references the ID field on the manufacturer table. So now that we've done that, let's actually go and make these changes permanent in our database. So it will be PHP bin /console doctrine migrations. I'll bump up this text for you. Doctrine : migrations : migrate. It'll ask you if you want to make the changes. Yes, I do. Okay, so let's go over to table plus and just make sure that that has actually happened. And so now we have a product table, and we can have a look at our structure there. So everything exactly the same as what we just saw with that SQL. And what we can do now is actually go back to our user interface here, and we'll just check out the product schema and see what it says about this. And so you can see all the different fields. If you notice manufacturer at the bottom, you'll see something interesting here. It says string IRI reference, and so we'll get to that shortly, but that is going to be the way that we reference using our API, how we reference the manufacturer for each product. Let's go and actually retrieve our manufacturers. Okay, so we get our response back. Now let's study this in a little bit more detail than what we have done so far. What we're creating here, or what the API platform is creating for us, is a hypermedia API, and every resource in a hypermedia API is identified by something called an IRI, which stands for Internationalized Resource Identifier. And so what we're looking at here is our IRI, this ID value here, and as you can see, it's a URL. A URL is a valid IRI, and that is what the JSON LD format uses. And so in order for our products to identify their manufacturer, their parent manufacturer resource, then we use the IRI for that manufacturer. Hope that makes sense. It's probably a lot of terminology to take in if it's the first time you've heard this stuff, but all you need to know is that in order for our API, in order for our products to reference their parent manufacturers using the API, then we use the IRI. So if we go to create a product now, then this is what we need to use as a reference to the manufacturer. Let's go and give it a go, and then hopefully that should all make sense. So in products here, we're going to create a product resource, and if we click try it out, so you'll see all the fields here. The one we've just been talking about, the manufacturer, this is where we need to use the IRI as the reference. So I shall paste that in there. The MPN, so this can just be a string, so we'll just call it foobar for the sake of just coming up with anything. The name, okay, what should we call this? So here I have a list of Acme products from the Roadrunner cartoon. Isn't the internet brilliant? So rocket powered roller skates, that sounds like a good name for a product. So we'll go and drop that in there, and we'll just grab the description as well. It says let's you skate at unlimited speed. Okay, we'll paste that in as well. So I think we've got everything there. Let's execute this. Okay, so we get a 201 response. That sounds good. That means that something has been saved. And if we actually study the fields which have come back in the response body, so the ones we're looking at is the ID, so that shows us that a new record has been created with an ID. MPN is foobar, all the fields that we gave it there. And then if you look at the manufacturer, you'll see that it uses that IRI. Let's go over to the database and see what's been created. So I'll just refresh this, and then we'll look at the data. Okay, so this is all good. We've got an ID of 1. It's referencing manufacturer with an ID of 1, which if we look at the manufacturer table, that is the ID for Acme Core. The name is rocket powered roller skates, blah, blah, blah. All that has been saved correctly. So we have a nice working API. We're able to reference certain resources with other resources. I think our next move will be to actually add some validation to our entities to make sure that we can't enter empty strings in the database where we're expecting data and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to cover in the next one. Okay, so this is part 5. I've called the branch validation, so no prizes for guessing what we're going to be working on this one. Before we get into writing any code, let me just show you something. If I want to go and create a record at the moment, if I want to create a manufacturer, I just come to the user interface here, click try it out like we did before, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave the name blank. Description, I'll just make up something random. So random description, and we'll put a country code of UK, and then for the listed date, that will still work like that. So if I go and execute this, okay, so we get 201, which means that a record has been created. And if we look at the record which has been created, it says that the name is blank. Let's go and look at our database and just confirm what it's telling us here. So refresh the manufacturers, and so as you can see, we have a new manufacturer has been created, ID of 3, but we have an empty name. Do we really want to be creating manufacturers that have empty names, or do we even want to allow users to be able to create a manufacturer with no name? It doesn't make sense to have a manufacturer with no name. So we need to put some measures in place to prevent this from happening. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use validation. So what we use is Symfony's validator component, and the same way that where we marked the class as an API resource using attributes, we can do the very same thing using attributes to mark to actually add our validation. So use Symfony component validator constraints as assert. So that's a typical way that we do this, that we add them. And the way that this will work is when the information, when the JSON is received by our API, by the backend, what happens is it gets deserialized from JSON into an object, into these objects that you see here that we've created our resource from, and it's going to be at that point when we're actually deserializing that the validation will be triggered, and if it doesn't meet the certain constraints, the requirements of the constraints, then what will happen is a validation error will be created, and then a response will be sent back saying, hey, I couldn't create this resource for you because this information is either missing or it's incorrect, or however we set up the constraint. In this case here, we're just going to leave ID that will be created by the database, but for the name, what we're going to do is we're going to add one called not blank. Okay, and then for the description, we're going to do the same, and so not blank means that you can't we won't be able to try and insert an empty string. So same again, not blank. And it's going to be the same for most of these. We'll just keep it simple. I don't want this to become like a big validation lesson because this is a API platform crash course, not an in-depth course. It's to get you up and running, but I'm just showing you how, and then if you want to dive into it a bit more deeply, then of course go ahead and do that. So country code, again, not blank. Listed date, what we're going to use here is we're going to say not null. So just going to do the same thing, leave it blank, and so don't refresh your page or anything, just if you've been following along, just use the exact same detail that what we used here. We're going to click execute, and this time we should see a 422 status code, which we do, which means it's a validation error. And so let's examine the detail, the information that we've got back here. So it says context, API contexts, constraint violation list, type constraint violation list, and then we have Hydra title and error occurred, and then it says the description name, colon, this value should not be blank. So it's saying that the name field, we've tried to insert a blank name field, it's not allowed us, and so it's come back with this 422 error response, which is perfect. Let's refresh our database just to make sure that nothing has been inserted, and as you can see, before it's even got to that stage, it's actually triggered the constraint violation and returned us our response. So it's working perfectly. We're going to need to do the same thing for the product. So if you want to have a go at that, then of course pause me now, and because I think by practicing these things it makes the knowledge stick, so next time you come to do it, because you've actually thought about it yourself, it'll just make it easier. But here's how I'm going to do it. It's going to be very similar to the manufacturer. So first thing we need to do is add our use statement for the constraints. So it will be use Symfony component validator constraints as assert. Let's just go down these properties. ID is going to be generated by the database. For MPN, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say not null for this one. And then for the name, we'll say not blank. Description, so exactly the same as what we did for manufacturer really, not blank. And then for the issue date, we'll go with not null. And so we need the post operation to API products, MPN. Let's actually, we'll leave that blank, and so it said that can't be null. So what I'm going to do is actually just going to remove it completely, and then for the rest of these, for the name, we'll actually leave that blank. We'll try and trigger a couple of constraint violations. Description, a random description, and then issue date, we'll just leave that as that. And we'll actually add a viable manufacturer, so it will be API manufacturers, and then we'll say manufacturer number 1 because we know we've got one of those. Let's click on execute. And so we get a 422 back, which is good news. And as you can see, this time we have a couple of violations. So the information is pretty much the same here. Hydra description npm, this value should not be null, and then it says new line. So you see the little new line character there, and it says name, this value should not be blank. But you see our violations array this time is we have 2 items in there. So npm and name, and they have different error messages. For the not null one, it says this value should not be null, and for the not blank, it says this value should not be blank. Okay, perfect. So that's working great. We now know that users can't use our API to insert records into the database which have incorrect data or which have missing data, and so mission accomplished. In this one, we're going to have a look at something called Postman, which is a tool for making HTTP requests in much the same way as what we've been doing with the API platform user interface that we've used here. So I'll say from the outset that it's entirely optional if you want to use Postman or not, because you do have something here which is perfectly fine and works. One thing I find with the API platform user interface here, which isn't a bad thing, but is that when you do make the request, there's quite a lot of information there on the screen, a lot of peripheral information in my case, which I'm probably not going to use. I'm only interested in the request body, and also I just like using Postman. I like the way it works, and it's an industry standard tool which a lot of developers use for developing and testing APIs, so I think it'll just be nice to introduce into this crash course. You may use it already, or it might be something that you'd like to learn. We're not going to go into it in great depth. I'm just going to show you how to do the same things as what we've already been doing here, which is making requests and reading the responses. So the first thing you need to do if you don't already have Postman installed on your machine, and if you do want to follow along and use Postman rather than the API platform interface, is come here to postman.com/downloads, download the version for your system, and then once you have that downloaded, just open it up and you should be greeted with something like this. So we're starting with a blank page, a blank canvas, and all we need to do then is just start making requests the same way, or adding our operations in order to make requests in the same way as what we've been doing up to now. And so what I'll do is I click on this little plus here, and then it opens this, and I'm going to send a GET request to. If you go to the headers tab here, we're just going to add an accept header, and this will be application. And so if I click on application /JSON, I'm just going to edit this, and it will be LD plus JSON. Okay, and then I can send my request. And so as you can see there, it went off, sent a request, and this is the body of the response that we get back. And just like with our API platform user interface, we're getting the exact same information back, obviously. And you'll see the key here, Hydra : member, and then each of the items underneath that array, we refer to them as a JSON LD document, and these are basically our records which we have in our system. So we have our Acme Core record, and we also have the one with the empty name which we used in the validation lesson. Now there's a way in which we can easily group all our related endpoints, and so if we come and click this little save here, it'll ask you to give your endpoint a name. So I'm just going to change this to get and then /manufacturers. And what I'll do, if you see down here, it says new collection, so we'll create a new collection called products API, and then all our endpoints for the products API will all be grouped under the one collection. So products API, and then click create, and then click save. And then if we come over here, you'll see this little like a folder tab, and there we have our products API with one endpoint in there. And so if I click on these three dots, I can duplicate that and start to create another one. So I'll click on this one, and I'm actually going to change this to a post request. Again, it's going to the same endpoint, so this time we're not going to retrieve them from the database, we're going to create new ones. And so headers, same value there, application /LD plus JSON, except this time we need to actually create a body for our request. And so choose raw from this drop down menu here, and then we're actually going to choose JSON, and we'll just drop that in there as the body. And it's got this handy little button here, beautify, which will actually just format the JSON nicely for us. And so this time we can actually create a manufacturer, so I'll say a, and so I've just called it a new manufacturer, giving it the same name for the description because we're not really bothered about what data we're entering. Here I'm going to change this to post manufacturers. I'll just remove the word copy, and then if I save this, as you can see now in our collection we have a get endpoint to manufacturers and we have a post endpoint to manufacturers. Let's actually give this a try. So we'll send that. I'm just going to close this. And so we have a 201 status, and as you can see, it's created us a new record with an ID of 4. Name new manufacturer, description new manufacturer, and country code is FR. To finish off, let's create a post route to our product. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this again. So the quickest way to get up and running with a new endpoint is to duplicate an existing one and just edit it to how you want it. And so this time we're going to say post to products. So the endpoint will be localhost /API products. Headers will be the same. The body this time will be different. And so the body should look like this. NPN, let's actually just make up some random letters here and so a few numbers. Name. And so all the usual stuff there, just make up some details. What we'll do is we'll actually go and get the ID, so the IRI that we got back when we just created that new manufacturer, and so we'll create a product for that manufacturer this time. Okay, so this looks good. Let's send this request. And we'll get a 201 back, so that's looking good. And we have an ID of 2, so that tells me, or I can assume, that a record has been created in the database, because I knew I only had 1 in there, and that 2 will only get generated if a record does get created. So I'm pretty confident that this has worked and it's all looking good. So if you've managed to follow along, well done. You now have a industry standard API development and testing tool installed, and you know how to use it and how to go and hit endpoints in the same way as what we've been doing with the API platform user interface. Let's move on, and we'll use this in some of the future videos from here. In this one, we're going to have a quick look, a little bit of theory regarding some of the parts which you may have wondered about, and those being these things here, where we have the @ symbol and we're saying @context, @ID, @type. So this formatting here is actually JSON LD. If we go back to the headers for this GET request route, so I created this accept header here, and we said application /LD plus JSON. If I actually go and change this to application /JSON and send the request off again, so this time it just comes back as plain JSON. It's no longer JSON LD format, so we just see the fields which we defined on our model. So JSON LD, what is it? Basically, JSON LD is a format which gives meaning to API data, and that enables machines to learn about your API. If I just go and change this back here to LD plus JSON again, and we'll send the request again just so that we can get some of this JSON LD format here. So the @ symbol, we briefly touched on this before, but in a REST API, each URL represents a resource, so it makes total sense to set that value to the unique identifier, which is the @ID. Type, so this goes hand in hand with context, so we're saying the type is manufacturer. However, if we want to learn more about what a manufacturer is, then we can follow this link here. If I click on where it says API context manufacturer, that will open me a page, and so now I have this API context manufacturer, and as you can see, we have some more information regarding our manufacturer. Not a lot of information, granted, however we can find out more if we click on the @vocab link here. And so here you can find out a lot more information about the API. So the way to think of it is sort of like this. If you think about semantic web and semantic HTML, where meaning is given to certain tags in a HTML document, it's kind of like that, but for API. So it's giving our API, it's documenting it in a meaningful way, in a way which other machines will be able to understand, because humans can sort of guess what these things are, what a type is, what certain properties are. However, it's not possible for a machine to understand that stuff, and so we give this extra level of semantics using JSON LD. And as we're looking through this document, you'll keep seeing this word Hydra keeps reappearing. So what does Hydra mean? Hydra extends JSON LD, making it possible to define things about your API with greater granularity. So we're talking about things such as, here you see supported class, and you can see our product class. I'll close this one. You can also see under supported class manufacturer, and then it has things like supported property, so you can see all the different properties which we set, such as name, ID, description, things like that, and also other things such as supported operations. So what operations can you perform on this resource? So we're saying here that you can do get, delete, put, patch, so all supported operations for that resource are also listed here. So like I say, it just defines things about your API with that greater bit of detail. So just keeping this one short, it's been a high level explanation of what these things are, so that when you do see JSON LD format, you know what these things mean: ID, type, context, etc. If you do want to know more about them and you want to go and do some research, I'll leave some links underneath this video, but for now let's move on. In this one, we're going to have a look at the resource operations, and I'll show you some configuration which allows us to restrict which operations are available to a client which is using our API. So let's just start off nice and gentle. We'll go down them one by one, and I'll explain each one's and the difference between where you see things like this. You have two gets. You have a get at this level and one at this level. So these top two operations which you see here, we refer to these as collection operations because the action is performed on a collection. For example, if I want to retrieve manufacturers, I'm retrieving a collection of manufacturers. If I want to post to manufacturers, I'm creating a manufacturer, I'm adding to the manufacturer's collection, if you like. And so this is why we refer to these operations as collection operations. So we've seen them both already, but let's just have a quick reminder. So we'll try this out. We'll execute this, and this will bring us back our collection of manufacturers. And so the next one down, if we just close this, is to post to create a new manufacturer, entirely new manufacturer from fresh. So we shall just call this okay, brand new manufacturer, an example manufacturer. Execute this, and then we should see 201, which means a new resource has been created. Okay, great stuff. Let's go back and now have a look at the other operations. So the ones where you see an ID, these are called item operations because you are performing the operation on just a single item. So if I say get API manufacturer's ID, all I do is provide an ID, and that will retrieve just a single manufacturer, so like you see here. And the same goes for the other operation. So we have put and patch. I'll not show you put, I'll show you patch in a second, but basically put is for replacing all of the data for a particular manufacturer, which isn't that common, to be honest, so that's why I'm just going to show you patch. If you're updating a record, patch is probably the one that you're most likely to use, because that means you're just updating the fields which you want to update. So if we just wanted to update the manufacturer's name, then we would use patch instead of put, because that's more suitable. And the other one is delete. So let's have a quick look at Table Plus and see what records we have for our manufacturer. So I'll refresh this. So what I'll do is I'll go and delete the new one which I created there, which was number 5. And so all you do is you provide the ID which you want to delete, hit execute, and it comes back with a 204 response. If we see what that means here, it says manufacturer resource deleted. Let's go and check out our database just to confirm that that is correct. And so our resource number 5 has now been deleted. Okay, so we just need to finish off with patch, and then what I'll do is I'll go and show you some other stuff in our code. So patch, say for example we just want to update the name. So we'll do this for manufacturer number 4. So I'm being quite explicit about it there. I've just called it a brand new name. hit execute, and then if we come down here, so for our patch we get a 200 status code, and you'll notice that it sends back all the fields. So even though we only updated one field, in the response body it'll send back you the entire resource with all of the fields here. So we can see it was our resource number 4 and its name is now a brand new name. Let's just check that in the database, refresh, and so as you can see just that one field has been updated. Let's now jump into our manufacturer class and I'll show you some configuration you can do on the operations which are permitted on this resource. And so before I start this, I should point out that this is where you will do most of your work. It will be configuring stuff on your API resource here, because things like routing, URL formatting, response body formats, status codes, things like that, all the RESTful API best practices and standards are all taken care of by the API platform, and all you need to do is actually configure it and tailor it to your needs. Let's start out first of all by configuring our collection operations on our manufacturer. So the way we do this is I've created some parentheses there for the API resource, and then we can just use named arguments. So what I need here is collection operations, and then it's an array of the operations which are permitted. So for example, if I just said get and then went back to our API interface here, you should see that our post collection operation for manufacturer has indeed disappeared. So what we've done there is we've made it so that only get is available for a manufacturer as a collection operation. But we'll not do that. We'll actually add post in there, and then we'll just go and refresh this and you should see it reappear. Okay, so we have our collection operations are back. What I do want to do is actually restrict this by removing delete from the item operations. So you could probably guess how you do this, but I'll show you anyway. We go here, add a comma after there, and then next what we're going to do is add item operations, and so you just include the ones which you want to see. So we're looking at get, put, and patch. And so if we go back and give our page a refresh, so now you see that delete has completely disappeared for a manufacturer, so that option is not available to me. What would happen if I did try and make a delete request? The only way I can do that now that it's not available to me on this interface page is to use a tool like Postman. So let's go over to Postman and we'll create a delete route and we'll give this a try. In the top left hand corner, if I open this up, which is my collections, then underneath where it says post manufacturers, I'm just going to duplicate this and then I'll click on that to open it up, and then we'll just go over and tailor this. So this, we want it to be delete, and then it's manufacturers / and then it will be an ID. So I'll represent that with parentheses. Okay, and so we change this where it says post to delete, and then on the end of here we add a number. So we'll say that we're going to delete manufacturer number 4, and then all we need to do now is just fire off this request. Okay, and so what we get back is a 405 method not allowed, and as you can see in the Hydra description, if I can just pull this up a bit, it says no route found for delete blah 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 manufacturers 4. So basically I cannot make a delete to the manufacturer's endpoint, and as you can see here it tells you the ones which are allowed, which is quite good. Allow get, put and patch. So as you can see, if you do get an error back from the API platform, some of the explanations in the descriptions are really good for explaining what you've tried and what has gone wrong and what is actually possible. So if you imagine that you were trying to create your own API from scratch, having to think of all these things would be really difficult, and this is just one of the beauties of the API platform really. There's so much done for you. So that's been an overview of operations, the difference between collection operations and item operations, and some of the things are possible. It's all a lot more configurable. You can configure it to a much greater degree, but for now I'm going to stick with the defaults and let's move on. In this one, we're going to have a look at how we can filter and order the data which we get back from our API. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to add some filters to my product resource or my product entity, depending on how you want to refer to it. And the way that it happens is we need to add something called an API filter. So just after where I've got API resource here on the product, I'm now going to add another one called API filter. So you'll see I'm getting a bit of auto completion. If you're not getting that with whatever tool you use, then what you need is this one here. So it comes from API platform core annotation API filter, and there's loads of different types of filters. There's search filters, date filters, boolean filters, number filters, range filters. I'll point you in the right direction in the documents after this, but for now we're just going to start off with, I shall say, a simple search filter, but that won't be giving it credit because it's actually really smart. So what we do is this: we say search filter class, and we're just going to have a look at some of the properties and see which one will be a good one to search on. So name will be a good one. So after we've said okay, we want to use a search filter, so it's comma, and then we create an array. So properties is the named argument that I'm using, and then this will be an array, and so we're going to say name, and then we have to choose the strategy. So do we want to match the name exactly? I don't think that would be great. I think what we'll do is we'll do a partial match, and so again I can get this from search filter, and as you can see I get a bunch of options here which come up. So we've got strategy, exact, partial, and so that's the one that we're going to use. But just to show you what the other ones are, strategy end, as in does the phrase end with this. Strategy start, does the phrase start with this. Okay, so but we're going to go with strategy partial, and if I just click on this and jump to it, all it is just a string saying partial. Okay, let's go and test this out. So we'll go over to Postman, and what I'm going to do here is just say name. And so as you can see, I've entered the query parameters in this little box, which is quite handy that Postman provides. But if you're using something like curl or whatever and you don't have this box, then all you need to do is just, after where we are going for our products here, you just say name equals iDrop. So it's just query parameters, that's all we're doing. We're just adding query parameters to the end of our URL. Let's send this off. Okay, and so we get one result back. I'll just make a little bit of room, and that is our product, which is called iDrops. And if you want to filter on more fields, all you do is you just simply add more. So let's also add description. So after there I'll put comma, description, and again we'll use the same strategy. So search filter, strategy partial, and let's go and try this one out. So in my params I'm going to say description skate. Okay, and we get our rocket powered roller skates back, and so you can actually combine them. So here we can say description equals skate and name equals rocket. So we'll send this again, because in the name we have rocket powered roller skates, so we still get that back. And so obviously, or not so obviously, it will do this from left to right. So it will filter on this first, and it'll get a data set, and then it will filter that data set next. Okay, so let me show you something else. Because we have our product is related to manufacturers, we can actually do a search using that relationship. So let's go back over to our product, and here what I'm going to do is say manufacturer, because that is what we called the relationship. Let's just go and remind ourselves. So here we have a property called manufacturer. Let's actually go and look at our manufacturer and see what would be a good candidate. Okay, so we have name, description, country code. So I think that will be good. We can filter on country code. So the way you do this is just use the dot syntax. So manufacturer and then country code, and here we're going to say exact. So search filter exact. Let's go over to Postman, So manufacturer, country code, and we'll just go with UK. So now we should only get products which are made by a UK manufacturer. So that's pretty cool. Send this off. Okay, and so we get soap, which is made by manufacturer 3, and then we get spiced rum, which is made by manufacturer number 5. Let's go and look at manufacturers number 3 and 5 just to make sure they are UK. So manufacturer 3 is Unilever UK, and manufacturer 5 is Diageo, which is also UK. Another type of filter that I'll show you, which is quite common, is an order filter. So what we need to do is underneath the API filter which we just created, we need to create another filter. So very important that you know that we are actually creating a different filter and not just adding a different sort of type of filter. We need to actually create another filter if you're going to use a different type. So API filter, and then this time it will be an order filter. So order filter class, and again we say properties, and what we're going to order on, I think, will be some kind of date. So the date we said here was issue date, so that's what we're going to filter on for this one. And that's all you need to do. You just need to specify the property, and then we'll add our ascending or descending when we go and add it to the query parameters. So let's go and give that a go now. So back over in Postman, the way that we do this is we say order, and then in square brackets we say the field, which will be issue date, and then here we just need to say whether we want this to be ascending or descending. So we're going to say descending, which means it will get us the latest issued products down to the oldest issued products. Let's send this off. Okay, so here is our result set, and as you can see, this top one here 2022, and then this one is 2010 and 2003, 1999. So as you can see, it's ordered all our products by issue date in descending order. That is really just scratching the surface on filters. If you want to know more, if I've not shown you something which you'd like to do, then just come and check out the filters in the API platform documentation. As you can see, there's absolutely loads of stuff that you can do here. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to achieve what you want to achieve. You just might have to dive into this stuff. So I've got search filters, date filters, booleans, numeric range filters, exist filter, all kinds of stuff. You can do stuff with Elasticsearch. Absolutely tons of filters and tons of options, really well thought out. And you can even create your own filters because, like I say, under the hood it's just using Doctrine ORM, so any of the stuff that you can do with that, you can actually go ahead create your own filters as well. So hope you've enjoyed that one. I think what we'll do now is we'll move on and we'll have a look at pagination. In this one we're going to have a look at pagination. So first off, what is pagination and how can it help us? If you can imagine, we had maybe thousands of records in our manufacturer's table in the database. We wouldn't want to be returning thousands of manufacturer records all at once. We'd want to sort of limit them and split them. And so pagination will work the same way in our API, in the same way as it does on websites. So what I'll do is we'll go over to Amazon here, and we have just a products page, various drum products, and down at the bottom you'll see these bits here. So if this is new to you, then that is your pagination. We're basically taking our record set and splitting it down into separate pages. So here we have page 1, and I can click to go to the next page by clicking page 2, and I'll go all the way down the bottom, and it gives you like handy little markers or handy little links that you can click to either go to the previous one or go to the next one. And sometimes you might see pagination where it says go to the first or go to the last. And so all sorts of different options, and I'll show you some of those that we can use with the API platform as well. In my manufacturers table in the database, I've added a few more records, otherwise it wouldn't be a very good demonstration because we only had a small handful of records in there. So now I've got 20 records in there. However, at the moment, I don't think that's going to be enough to demonstrate pagination because the default, I believe, is 30. One way to find out is you can actually say php bin console and then debug : config. So whenever you want to go and check your configuration for a particular aspect of your application in Symfony, you can say debug config, and then you need to, if I didn't provide it any arguments here, it would get the whole config. However, we just want to look at API platform. So one clue on how to get that is if we come to config here and packages, the name is API underscore platform. So if I actually use that in my console, API platform, then I should see only the config for my API platform settings. So let's have a look at this. Okay, and so here we go. So we'll scroll up and we're looking for pagination. Okay, so here we go, pagination, and that is under a key called collection, and then the items per page is here. Items per page equals 30. So even though I've got 20 records in the database, we won't be able to paginate at the moment because it's less than the actual items, the maximum items per page. So what we can do is, based on what we know about what keys we need to use, we can actually go and change our configuration in this file. So we'll have a look at that. And it was under collection, and then pagination, and then items per page. And we'll just set this to 10. Over in our little user interface, let's just go and try this out. So I'll click try it out. I'm on the get route for API manufacturers. I'm just going to hit execute. Okay, fairly quick, so it's come back with some records. Let's count these. So under Hydra member, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 records have come back, exactly what we expected there. So that's how to do it at a global config level. So we've overridden the default by actually updating that in our own config file, our API platform YAML file. We can actually override this at a resource level by going and specifying the pagination in our resources. So let's go over to manufacturer and have a go at that. Find your API resource in the attributes, and then here we need to say attributes, and then this will be an array, and the key is pagination items per page. So at a global level we've set it to 10. Let's actually set this to something less so that we know that that is being overridden. So I'm just setting mine to 5. I'm getting a squiggly line here because PHP Storm's asking me, do I want to put my named arguments in an order? So I might as well click yes just to make it stop asking me. Now let's go and try this out again. So we should see only 5 records come back this time. So I'll hit execute. Okay, let's go and count these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, perfect. So now we've overridden the global default and set it at a manufacturer level to only return us 5 manufacturer records. Let's go over to Postman and I'll show you some of the pagination keys that we have available to us, which we can use in our application to get the next page, previous page, stuff like that. So our route is API/manufacturers. So by default, this will just fetch page 1. So if I hit send, and then if we go down, so count these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I bumped up the font as well a bit because I realised it was a bit small in the previous recording, so apologies for that. Hope this is a bit better. Okay, so we have our 5 records there, and then we're looking for a key called Hydra View, and under here this is where you will find our pagination options. And so we have one called Hydra First, and so that is the key that you would look for in your application. So if you're writing code in your application which was interacting with the API and you wanted to get the first page, then you're looking for a key called Hydra First. If you're looking to get the last page, then obviously you're looking for Hydra Last, and if you're looking to get the next page, which in our case will be page 2, you're looking for Hydra Next. So let's actually be specific about the page we want. We'll start with page 1. So this will give us the exact same records back, which will be the first 5 records. Hit go, and so we get those first 5 records back. And then if I want to get the next page, all I would do is, instead of using page 1, my Hydra next value is just the same, except it's page 2. So make a note of which IDs we have here. So we have ID 1, which is Acme Core. That's currently our first record. Let's hit page 2. Okay, and so you can see that our first record that we've got back here is ID number 7, which is Toyota. And so, as you can see, we get 5 records back, but it is the next page. And if we want the last page, then it's telling us that the last page is page number 4. So here we can just say page number 4. Okay, and so this gives us manufacturer number 17, 18, 19, 20, and that is it. One thing I spotted, which I should point out, is that if you're just returning application JSON, so when you pass this header, you're saying to the API platform, this is the format that I want the data back in. So if you say I want the data to come back in application JSON format, so just plain JSON, you'll see that we only have the records here. We don't actually have any pagination data, so that's just one thing to look out for. Perhaps there is a way where you can get the pagination data using JSON. That's something I'll look into, but for the time being, just be aware that you're not going to get it by default if you request the application JSON format. And so that has been pagination. Like most other things in the API platform, all the hard work's been done for you, just a little bit of configuration, and you've actually got something which performs the queries under the hood and gives everything back to you in a nice format with keys where you can go and select previous, next, etc. All the pagination, typical pagination features that you would expect. Let's move on. We've seen up to now that in order to be able to read or write values on our resources, all we need to do is, using PHP, just make them publicly readable or writable. So an example of what I mean is here I have my product class. So all the properties are private by default. However, we gave these public getters and setters, which means that they are exposed by our API in order for a client to be able to read them or write to them. If we go over to our user interface here and have a look at our product, so if I was to say get all products, so I'll try this out and we'll just hit go. It means that we get back all the fields which are public, but that might not be the best solution for our needs. We might want to have public getters and setters because our application might need them to do the things that it wants to do, but we might not want to make them publicly available for a HTTP client to actually go and read and write. In this one, I'm going to show you how you can use the serialization process in order to decide which properties have read and write access. And the way it works is highlighted in this diagram here. So let's think about the read side of the process now. So you got a table in the database that gets converted into an object, in our case a doctrine entity, and then we have a normalizing process. And so normalizing means it's going to take that object and convert it into an array, and then after that it gets converted into the format of choice, and so in our case it's converting it to JSON LD. The reverse of that process is when you are creating a write, you're creating a new object, say for example creating a new product record. So we post JSON, that gets decoded into an array and then denormalized into an object, and it's at this stage, normalize and denormalize, where you can decide which fields from that array are going to go into that array in order to actually form your object or to form your JSON response. A demonstration will make this a lot clearer. So let's go over to our product, and in the API resource attribute at the top here, we're going to add something called a normalization context, and here you can create groups and then you just add your properties to those groups which you create. So say for example we just want to be able to read the name. What I'll do is I shall create a group, and I'm just going to call this read, and then what I do is I go to name, and here where I have my assert not blank attribute, I'm going to add another one underneath this, and this will be called groups, and then I just need to specify the group. So I'm going to create an array, and I'm just going to say read. And if I go back to our little user interface thing here, and I'm just going to retrieve the products. Okay, and so this time, as you can see, the only property that we're getting back is the name. So here are my groups for normalization, and it's just this one group, read, and I've only assigned one property to that read group, and so that will be the only property that is going to be normalized and the only property that we'll be able to read. So this isn't great at the moment. Let's add a few more to our read group. So just behind the scenes there, I've gone ahead and I've added one to MPN. We'd already done name. I've added it to description, and I've also added it to issue date. So if we go back and try this out again now, so I'm just going to get all products, click try it out, execute. And so as you can see, this time we're getting 4 fields which can be read. So how about write? Very similar to the normalization context. So I add a comma, I'm going to drop down here, and this time we're going to say denormalization context. Again, I'm going to create a groups array, and this time we're going to call it write, but just on that subject. I don't have to call these read and write. I could call them whatever I want. I could give these groups whatever name I want, but I'm just calling them this just so I know what each one is going to do. So now that I've done this, let's go and assign this to some of the properties. So which ones would be good? MPN, okay, we can add one there. Name, so I've added it to description. For the issue date, I'm going to leave that as read only, so I'm not going to allow anyone to be able to write that. And also manufacturer, I'm not going to allow this to be writable, but I'm going to make it readable. So just here we'll do the same thing. Okay, so first off, let me show you the post. So back over to our user interface, let's just refresh this, and we should see which fields can be written. Okay, and so it's saying the fields which can be written are MPN, name and description. So you'll see that issue date and also manufacturer aren't there. On the subject of manufacturer, we made that readable. Let's go and get our products, and I'll show you the format that the manufacturer comes back in if I execute this. And so as you can see, we get the manufacturer back as an IRI, which means that if I'd sent a request off for this product and then I got this information back, if I wanted to then go and look up the manufacturer, all I would need to do is access the manufacturer key here. That will give me the IRI, and then all I'd have to do is send a request off for that. But maybe you might not want to actually send off 2 requests. Maybe you'd like some information regarding the manufacturer to come back as part of your products request. What I'm going to do first is just change these group names to be a little bit more descriptive. So where I have read, I'm just going to find all of these. I'm going to change it to product read. Okay, and then where I have write, you probably guess what I'm going to do here. I'm going to change this to product write. Okay, so let's just go and make sure that we haven't actually broken anything in the process there. So I'm just going to go and send off this request again. Okay, and we still get the same fields back, so nothing has broken there. So what we want to do is add some manufacturer related fields to our product request. So I can take this group name here, if I go over to my manufacturer, and we'll say that we want to get the name. And so what I do here is, again, using groups exactly the same as what we did in our product, and then I'm just going to paste that in there, product read. And if we go back over and actually try this again, I hit execute, and this time, as you can see, we're not just getting the IRI back from the manufacturer, we're actually getting an object. We have the ID, so we still have the IRI if we want to go and actually look at the manufacturer individually, but you'll see there that we have the name. So we added the name to the product read group, and so this is coming back when our products are read. That should provide a fairly decent overview of how this stuff works and also give you some extra control over your reads and writes. If you want to look more into this stuff or you need more granularity, then check out the stuff under serialization, and in particular the serialization group stuff. You can get into this in way more depth because you can do things like adding different normalization contexts groups to your operations, for example get, put, like is demonstrated here in the documentation. So be sure to check that stuff out. Let's move on. In this one we're going to have a look at sub-resources, and so what I mean by that will be something like how would I get all of the products for a particular manufacturer. Before we get into it, let me just let you know that the GitHub branch for this recording will be called sub-resources. So if you go to the repo for this on GitHub, look for the sub-resources branch and then you'll see all the code which I write in this video there. Okay, so there's two ways we can do this. One way should look quite familiar to you because we can do it using filtering. So if I go over to my product class, and just a reminder on what we did with filtering here. So we set up a search filter and we had one here which was manufacturer country code. So we looked for all products which were made by a manufacturer residing in a particular country. So we can use a similar strategy if we want to get all the products for a manufacturer given their ID, which is like a typical way that you would do this kind of search on an API. What I'll do is I'll just copy this line and we'll go and edit it. So instead of saying manufacturer country code, we'll say manufacturer ID, and again the strategy will be exact. It needs to be an exact match on the ID. If we go over to our little interface here and just refresh this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is search for products, and here we should see a new one. So as you can see, it's now added manufacturer ID as one of the search filters. Let's try this out, and so we'll search for all products with a manufacturer ID of 4, hit execute, and the first thing I want to show you is the actual request URL which was created. As you can see, it's a bit like the filtering, or it's exactly like the filtering because that's what we're doing. We're saying manufacturer ID equals 4, so all the products were manufacturer ID equals 4, and as you can see when you actually look at the manufacturer records here, we just have the one. That would be one way of doing it, using filtering. The other way is to actually go and mark a property as a sub-resource. So we need to go over to manufacturer for this, and we need to look for our products property, and so down at the bottom here, and then what we're going to do is just mark this as a sub-resource using attributes. So it's called API sub-resource. And then if we go back and give this a refresh, we should see that some URLs have been generated for us. Okay, and so this is what we're looking at here. We now have this URL here. So it's API manufacturers, the ID of the manufacturer, and then products. So let's go and try this out. And we'll go with manufacturer. Let's pick a different ID. We'll go with number 5 and we'll hit execute. And so here we go, we just got one item back again, but as you can see the manufacturer is manufacturer number 5 when we look at the ID. I'll show you how we can try this out in Postman. So we just need to alter our URL here. So API manufacturers, we'll change this to number 1 this time, / products. So this time we should get all of the products for manufacturer number 1. Let's go and send this. Okay, and so we get a couple of products here, but as you can see the manufacturer is manufacturer number 1, and that's all there is to it. Like everything else in API platform, very easy. All we needed to do was just add a single attribute there, and then we could access that access the products from the manufacturer as a sub-resource. And so you might be asking yourself, which of these two strategies should you use? And the answer is, it doesn't really matter, it's entirely up to you. No one strategy is any better than the other, they're both legitimate. In In this one, we're going to have a look at testing our API. So we'll get a nice test setup created. We'll have a test database. We'll pull in some packages which are going to help us make those requests or simulate requests to our API, and also make assertions against the schema or the JSON which we get back. So the first thing we're going to do is actually set up our test database, because I think it's important to have a separate test database. Not essential, but it means that you're not polluting your development database with test data, and also it means we can have a setup which starts in the exact same state for every test, so that you don't have other developers that like adding new records in there which make your test fail, things like that. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Symfony already, but I'll show you how the test database setup works in there. So if we go back and have a look at our env file, where we determined our database URL here, and we said that our database name would be products API. If we go over to the config folder here, and in packages, test, doctrine.yaml, you'll see that we have DB name suffix. So ignore this part on the end here, this environment variable thing, but what we're looking at is this. So what that means, it will append the word underscore test onto the end of your database, and so we're going to just run a couple of commands, and that will create us a test database with that name. So back to our notes. The command that we need in order to create our test database is this one. So I'll paste this in my terminal and I'll explain this to you. So Symfony console, it's all the same as when we created our development database, except here after Symfony console we're saying env equals test, and then by doing that it will then create us a test environment database. Let's hit go. Okay, and so it's saying it's created products API test database. I'm going to go over to Table Plus and just make sure that I have that there. Okay, and so here's my products API test database. Obviously there's no tables in there yet because we need to go and migrate our schema. Let's go and do that next. So the next command is this one, Symfony console, and again we're passing env test, and it's just doctrine migrations migrate. I'll copy that, paste that in there, run that, and it'll ask me if I'm sure. I'll just say yes. Okay, and so it's saying that it's migrating my database. Let's go back to Table Plus, refresh. Great stuff. So now we have a manufacturer table and a product table. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to composer require some packages, and they are Alice. Because we're using Symfony Flex, we can just use a short name for these. So Alice, Symfony Test Pack, Symfony HTTP Client, and something called JSON Schema. So what are these? Alice is used to generate fake fixture data. Symfony Test Pack includes PHP Unit and PHP Unit Bridge. HTTP Client is what the API platform test client is built on. So HTTP client is a Symfony component for making requests, and JSON Schema provides JSON Schema test assertions. Okay, so let's go and pull that in. The next thing I'm going to do is set up some test fixtures. So inside of a fixtures folder, which you see here, I'm just going to add a YAML file for the manufacturer and one for the product. And so I'll just paste in something which I've previously created. Should be self-explanatory. This is saying that this is the entity or the model that this is based on. This is what can be used to reference each particular record. So we'll be able to reference a manufacturer from our product fixtures. And then here is how we create each of the fields. So this is just going to give it a company name. This will just provide some text for the description. It will generate a country code for the country code and a date time for the listed date. So now let's go over to our product fixture or product YAML file, and we'll do the same here. Okay, so let me just talk you through this. It's the same as what we did for the manufacturer. So again, our entity is the product, and then we're going to create 100 this time. So what this is we're creating products from number 1 to 100. MPN, I've just used ISBN because that's probably the closest thing I can think of, that there's no special item in Faker in order to generate MPN, so I'm just using that. Name, I've just gone with catchphrase. These things aren't really that important. Description, just creating a sentence made up of 6 words. Issue date, again using a date time. Manufacturer, because if you think about our products, we can't create products without a manufacturer, so what this will do is it will just reference manufacturers from our manufacturer YAML file here. So where we're saying manufacturer underscore 1 to 10, what this will do is it will reference one of those for each of the products. I'll go back to my notes file, and so we have a command here which will load our fixtures that we just created. So grab this, and then I'll go and paste this in here. And again, make sure that you are in test environment when you run this, otherwise you'll end up populating your development database. Okay, let's hit go. And it'll ask you if you want to continue. Okay, so these notices here, they're just a deprecation notice. I'll show you how we can get rid of these for our tests, but it's not come back with any errors, so that's telling me that this has actually worked first time, which is a bit of a miracle because that has rarely happened before. Refresh. Okay, great stuff. So it looks like we have 100 products. Perfect, and we also have 10 manufacturers. We'll just check the manufacturer IDs on our products. Yep, they run 1 to 10. Okay, so that's worked perfectly first time. Great stuff. We're now ready to actually go and start writing our tests, I think. So the folder is tests, and in here we'll just create one test. So I would normally split things down into like unit tests and feature tests and things like that, but I'm only going to create one test here because I'm just showing you how you can do this. If you're building your own API, then obviously you'll go and put a bit more effort into your folder structures and things like that. So we'll call this products test, and this will extend a test case called API test case, and that will give us some of the tools we need. So things like being able to simulate the HTTP request will have a client, and also some API specific assertions will be available to us. In order for all tests to start in the same state, we're going to pull in a little trait here called refresh database trait, and we're just going to have a little look in the comments and see what it says about this. Basically it's saying that it purges and loads the fixtures before the first test and wraps all the tests in the transaction that will be rolled back when it is finished. So that means that each test in our products test will start in exactly the same state with the same fixtures loaded. Okay, so I'm going to add a test for getting a collection. So test get collection. So here we're going to get a collection of products, and the way I can do that is like this. So static, and then create client, so that will give us our HTTP client, and then we're going to send a request which will be a get request. So the method is the first argument. The second argument is the URL, so that will be for us API products. I can check for a successful response like this. Assert response is successful, and that's all I need to do there. I can check headers. So assert response header same, and so we shall say content type, and I expect it to have this value here, application /LD plus JSON semicolon, character set is UTF-8. And then I can actually make assertions about the body. So this assert JSON, I'm looking for JSON contain. So I'm not looking for an exact match, I'm just making sure that the JSON which comes back does contain a subset which I specify. And so here you can pass it in array format, and I'm just going to paste in some work which I've previously done, because you don't want to see me type all this out. And so we're asserting that our JSON should contain this subset here. So it's all the stuff that you've seen using Postman, using the user interface thing. We're looking at our context, our ID, and then we've also got stuff regarding our pagination here under the Hydra view. And so I'm going to run this test initially, but I'm expecting this to fail because I've not actually set up pagination on my product yet. So let's go and run this. Okay, and so look for our failure, and here we're getting incorrect pagination because it's just my product is currently using default pagination. So in order to be able to test that and to demonstrate it, I really want to set up my own pagination. So we'll go over to product, and here under our API resource, I'm just going to add a new one, and I'm just going to borrow the one from manufacturer. So attributes pagination items per page is 5, which should make my test pass. So we should now get 20 pages in total. The last page should be 20 because 100 divided by 5 should give us 20. Let's go and run this. Okay, and this time we are green. So you'll see that we're getting these deprecation notices here, which I mentioned earlier. If we go to our notes, I've actually got a piece or a line which we can add to our PHP unit file. So go over to PHP unit XML dist, which you'll find in your project root. And just in here, see where you have the PHP tags and you have these server variables. Just drop that underneath there, and all we're saying is just disable our Symfony deprecations helper. Let's go and run this again. Okay, so this time we get our one test, 3 assertions, but we don't have those annoying deprecation notices in the way. Let's go and make an assertion about the number of items which are returned. So in order to do this, I'm just going to grab a response here. And what I'll do, because we're filling up our page a bit, is I'll make my font a little bit smaller. So we'll go with 22. Okay, and then just down here, I can say this assert count, because we're counting the items in an array. We should get 5 items. And if I say response to array, it will take our response and convert it to an array, and then we can count certain items, and we're going to count Hydra members. Okay, 1 test, 4 assertions this time. So I'm happy with that test. Let's now go and test pagination. So we'll hit another endpoint, except this time we'll head for page 2. We'll append page 2 or page 3 or something on the end of that. So test pagination. Okay, I'm going to go and borrow some of this stuff here. So I'll go and grab it all, but we'll just edit out the stuff that we don't really need. All I want to look at here really is the keys that we get here for our pagination. So we're going to make the request, we'll get a response. I'll not bother checking headers, we know that all that stuff works. What we're going to do here though is say page equals 2. And so that means that some of these things will change. We're getting back page 2. First will remain the same, last will remain the same, next will be 3, but we also want a previous. So I'll just drop that down there. I'll say Hydra previous, and that will be page 1. And I'll not bother doing a count. So yeah, like I say, basically I'm just looking to make sure that we get the correct pagination details back. Let's go and run this. Okay, 2 tests, 5 assertions. Let's just change some of these values. We'll change this to 18, for example, just to make sure. Okay, and it failed, so that's good. Change that back, and we'll test something else. Let's create a product. Test create product. Okay, so similar to making a GET request, all the we require the HTTP client, we make the request, except this time we're going to make a post request. So request, and the method will be post. And so we're going to need some more information this time. The URL will be the same, so we're posting to API products, but now we're going to need an array, and we're going to say JSON, and then we're going to pass an array of all of the properties, all the fields which we wish to fill on our newly created product. So I've just gone and pasted some stuff in there behind the scenes. All the usual stuff: MPN, name, description, issue date. The only risky strategy I'm taking here is I'm making the assumption that we have a manufacturer with an ID of 1 in our test fixtures which we created. So I do know that I have that. However, if we were to refresh this or run this again, then because it's a auto incrementing ID, it would actually start from 11, wouldn't it? So it means that I wouldn't have a manufacturer ID of 1. So I'm not going to change it, I'm going to leave it the way it is, but it's just to let you know that this is probably could be done better. The way you could do it better would be to actually make a request, actually send a request off to retrieve a manufacturer and just use the ID for the first manufacturer that you get back. But that's just a little hint or a little tip there that you could use. This time our response code should be a 201, so this assert response status code, same 201. Headers should be the same as the last test, or the first test, so we'll just go and grab that. Okay, so while I was recording this, I noticed an issue, and that was that the issue date wasn't writable, which meant that we weren't going to be able to write that to the database when we did this. So go over to your product and make the issue date also writable by saying product write. We'll make some assertions about the response body. So again, assert JSON contains. And so we're just looking to make sure that all these things are correct. The only thing I've made a bit different here is that this is a format that the issue date is going to come back in, even though we sent it off in this format. So just something to be aware of there. Let's actually go and run this and see how we get on. Okay, so we get 3 tests, 8 assertions. So you should be getting the gist of this now. Rather than see me type out these tests in full, what I'll do is I'll just paste them in and explain my way through them as we go. Okay, this time we're testing that we can update a product. So test update product. Setup is the same. Client create client. We're making a put request, but this time notice we've appended on a ID for the product which we want to update, whereas when we created a product we just needed to hit the endpoint API products. This time we need to specify which product is going to be, so I've gone with API products number 1, and then we're just going to update the description. So here we're saying an updated description, and then check that we get a successful response, and then we're just checking the JSON which comes back. Let's go and run this. Okay, so that's good. Then we'll do one final test we'll try and actually trigger some validation errors by sending incorrectly formatted body content or something like that. And so this is the test that I've created for this test create invalid product, and I've picked this case specifically because I noticed a mistake in my code, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and fix that, but I'm going to drive it out using a test. So here I'm saying static create client, we're making a post request to products, and then we're going to create a product. And this time I'm passing manufacturer null, which really we should have to pass a manufacturer in order to create a product record, because a product must have a manufacturer. But let's just go and see what happens when I run this. Okay, so I'm expecting a validation error. So here this assert response status code same 422. However, that's not what I'm getting back. It's saying failed asserting that the response status code is 422. If you notice here, the response status code is 201 created, which means it's been able to go ahead and actually create that record, which tells me that there's a problem with my code. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to product and just have a look at this, and I'm going to put a not null assertion in here. So assert not null, we'll drop that in here. Okay, and then we'll go and run the tests again and see what it tells us. Okay, and this time we have another failure. Failed asserting that response status code is 201 on line 68 of products test. So what's going on here? Let's go over to products test, and we're looking at line 68. So here, where we're saying assert response status code same 201, that's not what we're actually getting. We're not actually creating that record. And the reason is, even though we're passing a manufacturer string here, we haven't actually enabled write for manufacturer on our product. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to go and add that now. And we'll tidy this up a bit because it's getting a little bit messy. We'll drop this onto its own line. Okay, back to our test. Let's run it and see where we get this time. And so that tells us that we are getting a 201 saying the product has been correctly created, and it's also being correctly created with that manufacturer ID as well. And so we'll leave it there. Hopefully that's been helpful. You've probably been able to see that you could actually build your entire application just by using tests. It means we don't actually have to keep going over to Postman or going over to the user interface. We can stay in the same places where our code lives, just write our tests, go make any changes we need to make to our entities, to our attributes or things like that, as and when the test lets us know that something's going wrong. We're now going to have a look at security and authentication, which could become quite a big subject because the way that you authenticate will depend on the type of application that you are building. For example, you might be building an application where you're just consuming your own API. You might have a front end, which is JavaScript using React, Vue, Angular, or whatever, which just communicates with the back end, and in which case, just normal session authentication, which you use in any everyday web applications, would serve the purpose. You have email, password. Once you're logged in, then you'll have a session cookie and your front end will be free to communicate with the back end that way. You could be consuming a third-party API, and that's the type we're going to look at here by using API tokens. So the reason I've chosen to do this is that I'm aware that there are other tutorials online, for example Symfonycasts, where they've taken care of the first scenario where it's a JavaScript front end or a Jamstack type application which is consuming its own API. So I think by actually covering the other side, the API tokens type of authentication, it means that regardless of which type of application you are building, then at least there's information online to do either the Jamstack type where you consume your own API or the third-party authentication using API tokens. So let's make a start. In our application at the moment, we just have two different entities, and that is manufacturer and product. But in order to have authentication, we're going to need to have a user entity or some way of representing a user. So that's what we're going to do first. In order to do that, we're going to pull in a bundle called Maker Bundle, which will help us actually just build a user entity with some extra, which implements some extra interfaces which are used for authentication. So let's go over to our terminal. By the way, the branch for this lesson is called API Token. So if you go to GitHub and look at the branches, then API Token will be the one which is up to date for this lesson. Okay, so what we need is composer require maker, and so because we're using Symfony Flex, we can just use this short version of the command here, and this should go and get us the maker bundle. And if you don't know what the maker bundle is, what it does is it just gives you some assistance in creating things like entities for creating authenticators, which we'll probably look at in the next lesson. And so let's actually put that to practice now and have a go at making a user, which we can do with PHP bin console make user. So whereas you can sometimes use this to make entities, which we'll do when we come to making an API token, but if you actually say make user, then it will, although we are creating a user entity, it'll just do those extra things that we need for making a user for the purposes of authentication. So hit enter there, and it'll say the name of the security user class, and the default is user, so I can hit enter and it'll use that. Do you want to store user data in the database via doctrine? And the default is yes, so just hit enter again. Enter a property name that will be the unique display name for the user. Okay, so we're not going to get into this too much because we're mainly concerned with the API thing, so we'll stick with the default again, which will be email. Does the app need to hash check user passwords? So even though we are using API tokens, I'm just going to leave this as yes, because if you think of a normal application, or say you're signing up to a third-party API, before you actually get an API token, you actually need to be able to sign up to that. And so you'll just authenticate normally, you'll create an account using an email and a password, and then you'll go and create your API token once you've actually created your account. So we'll stick with yes for that. So this is quite easy. We've just stuck with all the defaults there so far. Let's close our terminal and let's go and have a look at our user entity. So here it is. We'll have a slow scroll through this. So you should see this class user implement user interface. Okay, so these are authentication related interfaces. We're just going to have a look at this, and you'll see that it has a few sort of authentication related kind of methods there. Let's actually go and have a look at this other one. So this is for when you're authenticating with passwords, then it says that you must implement a get password method. Okay, all good there. Keep scrolling through here. So here's our properties. I've kept it as light and simple as possible, and we're not going to use much of this stuff. ID, email, roles. So a user entity must have at least one role in order for authentication to work correctly in Symfony. I don't want to get too deep into that stuff. I do have a series on authentication in Symfony on YouTube. It's a bit dated, but the stuff regarding roles is still all relevant and still all works exactly the same way. Okay, and then we've got some getters and setters. It gets user identifier, so this is what Symfony's authentication, if we specify this is what it will use to identify a user. However, as you will see in the next lessons, we're actually going to use a token for the API side of things in order to identify a user. So don't get too hung up on any of this stuff for the moment. It's just showing you what has been created really. Most of this stuff is not really going to be relevant to us and the way that we're going to actually use it in API platform. Okay, so next thing what we need to do is we need to go and create a migration for this. So PHP bin console, I'm just going to say make migration, and that should work for our changes for our new user class which we've just created. Okay, and then let's go over to migrations and see what has been created. I usually make sure that I check these things before I actually migrate them to the database, just to be sure that it has created what I expected it to. So quick glance at that looks okay. I think we can go and run this migration now. So PHP bin console, and it will be Doctrine migrations migrate. Ask you if you want to make these changes, just click yes, and then let's go over to Table Plus and we'll just check out our new users table. Hit refresh there. Okay, and so we have an empty users table. We might as well put in a couple of users here so that we have something to work with. So I'm just going to say info@GaryClarkeTech. For roles, so you can't leave this as null, just put square brackets and that will represent an empty array of roles. And for password, I'm just going to type in some gibberish nonsense which looks like a password, and then just create another one, and that way we can play around with having users which do authenticate and users which don't authenticate, for example ones which have tokens and ones which don't. Again, for the password, I'm just typing in some gibberish because passwords aren't important to us. We're going to focus on API tokens. Okay, so I'll hit enter there and then Command S, and that should save those. Just refresh to make sure they are saved. Okay, great stuff. We can now move on to creating an API token entity. So, considerations regarding API tokens. I'm going to make a dedicated API token entity. You could have an API token field on your user entity. That will be perfectly valid. However, if you think about third-party API services, you often have the option to create a new token. Say, for example, you might think someone has compromised security or got hold of your token, or for whatever reason you might want to change your API token. But it wouldn't make a very good application if you just replaced one with the other. You might need that audit trail for whatever reason in order to see what previous API tokens you've had. And so for that reason and for various other reasons, I think it's best to model an API token, have a dedicated entity for that. And so that's what we're going to do. And we'll relate our API tokens to our users. So I'm going to clear my terminal and I'm going to say PHP bin console, and this time I'm going to say make entity. Okay, class name of the entity to create or update. So we're going to call this API token. Mark this class as an API platform resource. No, because this isn't a resource. It's not like our manufacturer or our product where we want people to be able to hit an endpoint and read information regarding it as a resource. So we're going to say no for this. And so we're only going to have a couple of properties, and one will be token, and that will be a string. We'll stick with the field length, cannot be nullable. Add another property. So we need a user property in order to relate our token to a user. So we'll say user, and this will be of type relation. So if I start typing relation, then it gives me some auto completion there. I'll hit enter. What class should this entity be related to? Again, if I start typing, it will give me some auto completion and it'll be related to a user. And relation type. So let's think about this. We want a user to be able to have many tokens because say for example a user has a token that expires, or for whatever they generate a new one, you still want to be able to keep that audit trail of the previous tokens, so a user needs to be able to have more than one token. However, an API token doesn't need to have more than one user, it will belong to just one user. So our type of relation is many tokens to one user, and so for that reason we're going to say many to one. Is the API token user property allowed to be null? And we shall say no. Do you want to add a new property to user so that you can access update API token objects from it? For example, user get API tokens. I think that would be very useful and would make for a good application, so we shall say yes. New field name inside user API tokens, that looks like a good name to me. Do you want to automatically delete orphaned API token objects? So what this means is if you remove a user, do you want to remove all the API tokens which belong to it from the database? I think that's probably a good thing to do. Just keep our database nice and clean, so we'll say yes. Add another property. So do we want any more properties? I think we're going to keep this nice and simple. I could have expiry dates or things like that, but let's not get too deep into that stuff. I just want to be able to show you how we can authenticate using a token. Most of our work is going to be centered on the Authenticator class, which we'll create in the next one. So we'll just hit enter and that will bring us out of that, and all we need to do is go and look at our new API token class or entity which we have created. And this is our API token. So just a couple of properties. We have the ID, auto incrementing ID, we have our token, and we'll generate one of those, or we'll do something quick and dirty in order to quickly make one of those in a minute. And then we have users. So let's have a look at this relationship here. So we have a many-to-one relationship. Our target entity is the user class, and it is inversed by an API tokens property. let's go and look at our user. And so here we can see that we have an API tokens property now, one user to many API tokens, target entities API token class, and it is mapped by the user property on the API token entity. One other thing I should show you here, which I think we'll end up using, is that we have repositories for our newly created classes. So we have a user repository, and then we have our API token repository. So when we generated our entities using the maker bundle, using the commands, the maker commands, then it generated repositories for us also, which is quite handy. And like I say, we'll probably end up using one or the other of these in order to assist us with our authentication. Let's go ahead and migrate our API token table. So PHP bin console make migration. Okay, and we'll go and look at our migrations folder. Should have a new one here for our API token. Let's just have a quick glance at this. Create table, API token, ID, user ID, token. Okay, that all looks good, and as you can see, we've got the foreign key constraint which references the ID column on the user table. So all we need to do now is just PHP bin console doctrine migrations migrate, and again choose yes, over to table plus, refresh, and so now we have an API token table and just three fields: the ID, the user ID, and the token. So let's finish off actually by adding a token to this database. I want something which looks like a fairly authentic looking API token, so I'm just going to knock up a quick little file here. It's up to you if you just want to type in some nonsensical characters in the API token field there, go ahead. I'm just going to make mine look a little bit like a real API token. So I'm creating a PHP file, and I'll just call this generate token. So this is just going to be a little throwaway thing here, and we'll say echo bin to hex, so binary to hexadecimal, and then we'll say random bytes 60 PHP end of line. And then if I go to my terminal and say PHP generate token, that looks like a pretty good API token to me. We'll copy that, go back to table plus, and we'll say 1, user ID will be 1, paste that in there, hit enter, save that. And so now we have a user table with a couple of example users in there. We have an API token table, and we have our user entity and API token entity, which we've related to each other using a API tokens property and a user property. In the next one, what we'll do is we'll actually start figuring out how to authenticate a user using API tokens by building a custom authenticator. We've now got a fairly basic but functional API token system set up. We have API token entities which we can relate to a user. So now we need to think about how we're going to actually authenticate a user using the API tokens. And what we're going to do is we're going to create something called an authenticator, a custom authenticator, which will be used simply for authenticating a user using an API token. And so the way that we do this is we're going to use the maker command like we did for making the API token. And the command is this, so PHP bin console, and this time it is make auth, and so we hit enter. Okay, what style of authentication do you want? It will ask you, so we'll go with empty authenticator, which is the default. The class name of the authenticator to create, so it needs to be something quite descriptive. In our case, we want it to be an API token authenticator. Let's just call it that. So API token authenticator. And that is it, would you believe? So now we should have an API token authenticator. Let's go over to our source file, and then in security you'll see a new file here, API token authenticator. And don't worry, this might look a little bit scary at first, but I'll talk you through all of these things. Basically what happens is The first method to be called is support, so a request will be sent into your application, and then what it will do, it will hit this method. Okay, regardless of whether you're saying you want to authenticate with API tokens or not, it will still hit this method because it is this method which makes the decision. Should this authenticator be called into play here? Is it relevant? And so in order to authenticate using this authenticator, the supports method needs to return a boolean, and that boolean needs to be true. Okay, so before we go any further, let's just give that a go. The first thing we'll do is we'll just die and dump you are here, just to show that this method is actually being called. So you are here, and then I've got Postman open, so I'm just going to go over to Postman and I'm firing a request at localhost API manufacturers. So let's hit go. Okay, and so we get you are here, so we have hit that request. So, and like I say, in order for this authenticator to be called into play to perform the authentication, then we need to return a true from here. So before we do that, just to show that that will take us on to the next step, I'm just going to hard code, or I'm just going to return true from this method, and then that should take us to this method here. So again, I'll die and dump out. We'll just put the name of the method. So this might look a little bit tedious, but like I'm teaching in baby steps, but if you've never done this kind of thing before, it's good to know how these things work, how the mechanics of it all works. So we're returning true from supports, which means yes, use this authenticator, and then it'll move on to the next method in this authenticator, which is the authenticate method. Back to Postman. Okay, and so I've now hit the next step, authenticate. So you're probably thinking, well, what would happen if that method hadn't returned true? And if it hadn't, it would just carried on its way. So we shall return false. It would have just carried on its way and done its normal thing without actually using this authenticator. So what I'm expecting back here is just a normal response as if we're not using any kind of authentication. Let's test that theory. Okay, and so as you can see, we've got our data back here, and that has happened. So we've managed to get the data back without authenticating. But we don't want to do it that way. We want to actually authenticate. So what condition should we apply here to say that yes, we want to authenticate using this authenticator? We're using a token. What we're going to do is pass that token as a header. And so here we'll just check for the presence of that header. So we shall return. And as you'll notice, we have the request which is being passed in here. So request headers has, and then we need a key, and so we shall just call this X API token, but you could call it anything. It's your application, but this kind of thing is quite common. You can also see X auth token, that kind of thing, all on a similar theme. They all mean the same thing really. And so if we actually sent this request now, we're not actually passing that header, we're not actually passing that key in the headers, and so what we should see is the same thing as what we saw last time. It's actually going to be false. However, if we actually go to our headers and add that, so X API token, and then it could be anything, because initially we're just checking that it's going to get past the supports method. So I'm just going to put in just some nonsense characters there, but that means that this key is present in the headers, and so it should move us on to the next step, which is the authenticate method. Let's send this, and if we look at preview, we have now moved on. Okay, that's all very good, but let's actually use a legitimate token. So we'll go to our database and grab a token from there. Okay, and then we're working with the real thing from now on. So I'm just going to replace this in here. Okay, good. Let's move over to our authenticate method, and we'll actually grab that API token and see how we can use it to authenticate the user. So API token, and again you'll see we have the request. So request headers, this time we're saying get, and it is X API token. Okay, let's just check that it has a value first. and if not, we need to throw some kind of exception. So if null equals API token, throw new, and we'll see a exception that we can throw here, custom user message authentication exception. Bit of a mouthful, but it was designed for this purpose, for using as part of the authentication. If some kind of error happens, then we can actually throw this exception. And what we'll just say is no API token. No API token provided. For authentication, we have something in Symfony called passports. Now, typically you'll use a traditional passport class, but because we're using an API token, we're going to use something called a self-validating passport. But we'll have a look at both just so that you can see how one differs from the other. So what we want to do here is return new self-validating passport. So we'll go and actually have a look at this. An implementation used when there are no credentials to be checked, i.e. API token authentication. So it suits our needs. The other type is passport, and so here you would normally also provide some credentials, e.g. a password, but because we're just using an API token, we're not matching a password up to an email or anything like that, so we can use the self-validating passport, and in that case we just need to pass in something which represents the user. To represent the user, we use something called a user badge, because a passport on its own would be of no use. You need something which is actually the owner of the passport, and so in our case, to represent that, that will be a user badge. So let's go and have a look and see what this does. We'll just read the comments at the top here, and as you can see, it says represents the user in the authentication process. It uses an identifier, e.g. email or username, and user loader to load the related user object. So we're going to need to use the API token in order to find the user and load the user. So the first argument needs to be the user identifier, which in our case is the API token, and then what we're going to do is we're going to need a callback, because we want to put some logic in here which is going to help us actually find the user. So we're going to need to do some kind of query. So new user badge API token, and then we need to figure out how this should work. And so what I'm thinking is we have a user repository. Let's just go and have a look at our files here. We have a user repository, so I'm thinking we can add a method to this which says find by API token or something along those lines. So let's go and write the code that we wish we had first, and then we'll implement it. So user equals, and then we need a user repository. So I'm thinking let's add a constructor at the top here where we can auto wire a user repository, and I shall initialize that. Okay, so we now have a user repository. So user equals this user repository, and we'll say find by API token, and of course passing in the API token. If we don't find a user, we want to throw a user not found exception. Otherwise, happy path, all has gone well, we can just return our user. Obviously, if we go and try this now, we're going to get some kind of exception because we don't have that method in our repository. So let's fire this off. Okay. And so we get an error occurred. App entity user has no field API token. You can therefore not call find by API token on the entity's repository. We need to now actually go and add a method to our repository to retrieve a user by an API token. So let's go over to our user repository, And I think we'll actually just drop it in at the top here underneath the constructor. So public function find by API token. Obviously it's going to need a token, so that will be a string. And this will return either null or a user entity. And so the way I think I'll do this is I'll find the API token in the database and use the relationship on that in order to get at the user. So we're going to need the API token repository also here. Let's write the code first and then we'll figure out how we're going to get all of this. So what I'm going to try is this: return this API token repository, find one by, and I just need to pass in my credentials here, and so that will be token API token, and then off of that I'm just going to use a null safe, and I want to get the user. So let's go and have a look at our API token entity, and here we have a method called getUser. So let's use that. And for some reason PHP Storm's complain here. Null safe operator is only allowed since PHP 8. I need to change my PHP version in PHP Storm so that it's reading PHP 8. Okay, and so it's happy with that. So now what we need to do is actually have an API token repository on our user repository. So I'll just drop the font just to make this a little easier to read. Okay, that's a bit better. And so just to recap on what we've done there, we've injected the API token repository, so that means we can attempt to grab an API token from the database using the find one by method. When we have that, we're actually going to return null if nothing comes back, otherwise we're going to get a user. And so let's go back to our API token authenticator, and if we get that user, let's actually just dump it out here. And so it looks like we are getting a user with an ID of 1. So that's good news. We know that that's working. Let's actually move on and show you what our next step is. So we have two paths out of our authenticate method, don't we? We're actually going to find a user, in which case we're going to return that user, and if that happens, then we have authentication success, and so we will then hit this method here on authentication success, and then we need to handle and decide what we're going to do when a user does authenticate. Otherwise, on the other side of the coin, if we don't have a user and a user not found exception is thrown, then we're going to have an authentication failure, in which case we need to decide how we're going to handle that. So let's actually get the dirty stuff out of the way first, and we'll deal with authentication failures. How can we actually set this up? A good way would be to just go back to our token here and actually just change the last character or remove the last character. Need to remember that the character was C though. Okay, so let's go over here and we'll just dump failing in our on authentication failure method, so we know that we are actually getting to the right place. Send the request, failing. Okay, great stuff. We'll just return a message with minimal information saying that bad credentials have been supplied. And so I'm creating a data array here, and we're going to pass this into the response, and then we're creating a message here using the exception message key and the message data, which should be something along the lines of incorrect credentials or bad credentials, and then we just need to return a JSON response. The first argument being the data which we just created, and then the second argument being a authentication failure, which will be a 401. HTTP unauthorized, which evaluates to 401, as you can see here. Okay, so let's go and give this a go. Okay, and so we get message invalid credentials, and as you can see we have a 401 unauthorized response. And so this is all you need really. You don't, if someone is attempting to access your application and they have invalid credentials, you don't want to be giving them too much information. Just tell them enough to know what the problem is so that someone should be able to go and fix it if they are legitimate. However, if they're not, if they're an attacker, then they don't have anything like enough information there in order to be able to go and actually take action which would allow them to get into your application. And so that handles failing authentication. However, what about when we do authenticate? Now, under normal circumstances, say you're authenticating with an email and a password on a web-facing application with a user interface or something like that, then when you authenticate, you'd want to be redirected to somewhere, another page, like a follow-up page after the login. However, that's not what we're looking at here. All we want to do is just for our application to behave as normal and just send back data, which is all that our application does. And so in those circumstances, we don't want to be redirecting or doing any of that stuff. So from here, we can simply return null. So let's go back to Postman. We'll fix our token. I think I just need to put the letter C back on there and then fire off the request again. Okay, and so we are now authenticating. It's sending us back the data. Okay, so that really takes care of authentication. We can now use an API token in order to access our application, fire off requests. So what we're going to actually look at now is something which sort of goes hand in hand, and that is authorization, i.e. what is a particular user allowed to do, because some users will be allowed to access certain data or do certain things which you don't want other users to do. And so we're going to have a look at access control, roles and permissions. In addition to that, because we've now added authentication, it probably means that some of our tests might be breaking or may need updating, and so we'll also do some updates to stuff we've already written. In this one, we're going to have a look at adding authentication to our tests, because if you remember, we actually wrote our test before we started the section on authentication. So I'm suspecting they're probably going to fail right now because we don't have authentication in those requests that we made there. Before I deal with that though, we're just going to tackle something which occurred to me and which has been bothering me, and that is this. So our supports method in the API Token Authenticator, I'm going to make an adjustment to this. But first off, I'll just show you the issue in case you haven't already thought of this yourself. So here we're passing the API token, there's the value, and then we just fire off our request, no problem there. If we actually go and change the token, so I'm just removing that last character there, and if we send this off, okay, so then we get invalid credentials. However, if we actually I can actually not send header by unchecking this box here, which means that header won't get sent. If I send it now, okay, so it's getting through authentication, because the way we've set this up is we're saying, does this API token header key exist? If so, then go on to authentication. If not, then what that means is don't actually use this API token authenticator. This isn't required. And in that case, it means everything's just going to go through as normal. So this setup really, the way I've done this, it's exactly the same as what the Symfony documentation, the example in there. However, it works well if you have other authenticators, because you can have multiple authenticators in your system. So say for example we had one which was a login form authenticator which required email and password. What happens is when you send the requests, it goes through all of the authenticators until it comes to one which is valid, one which applies to that scenario. So if we had a system where a dual authentication system where we were using API tokens for hitting the API, and if we were using email and password for a web-facing application, then fine, it would get to this one, the API Token Authenticator, and then see that it's not required because the XAPI token header isn't present, and so it would just move on to the next authenticator, which would be the login form authenticator, and attempt to log in that way. But we didn't set that up, we didn't build that, even though you probably would need to build that, because in order to get an API token you would need some kind of web-facing application in there. But what I'm going to do is just keep this simple, and I'm just going to alter this to make it more applicable to our system, which only has one way of authenticating. And so I'm using PHP 8. I can use the string starts with function, and then on here I'm just going to say request, and what you're looking for is get path info, and then that will bring you back the path. And so we're saying, does our path start with /API/, and in our case it does. So let's go and fire off this request again. Okay, so this time we're getting no API token provided because I didn't uncheck the box, but what we do know is that it's got past this stage. This has returned true. Our path does begin with API, and so now it's got to here. So we have that catch-all. If we don't have an API token header, then it's still going to fail authentication. So we'll put this back to the way it was, and we'll just test happy path first. Okay, so then we get our results, and then what we shall do is check that authentication fails if we remove a character from the token. Okay, good stuff. So I feel much happy about that. So in case you were wondering or suspecting that I'd done something which is insecure there, we've now dealt with that, and we can move on to sorting out our tests. So here's our products test. Rather than guess at what might fail and what might not fail, the first thing I do with my tests is I just simply run them. So vendor bin PHP unit tests. Okay, so we have some errors, and what I'm seeing here is base table of view not found products API test API token. And so let's go and actually have a look at our migrations, try and remind ourselves where we got up to. So I'm looking at the last migration, which would have been the last one to be created. So we have actually got the API token migration file. So all we need to do, I think, is just go and run our migrations migrate. This has already been done on our development database, so we need to run it for our test database. So the command that you need is this Symfony console, and what is different is this part here. We're saying environment equals test, and then all the rest is the same. Doctrine migrations migrate. Let's hit go. So it'll ask you if you're sure, and in fact it's just run straight on and it's migrated these. So let's go over to the database and check this. Our database was products API because we take the name of our regular dev database and it just appends on the word _test to the end of that. And so as we can see here, we've now got our API token table. So that's all good. I think we can go back and actually run the tests and see where it takes us this time. So vendor.bin PHP unit tests. Okay, so we've got a little bit further this time, and we're actually getting the message no API token provided. Okay, perfect. So over in products test, let's just take this one step at a time and we'll get our tests into the state that we need them to be in. First thing I'm going to do is actually create an API token constant. So what was our little file that we used? We created something in order. Here we go, generate token. So what I'm going to do is just say PHP generate token, and I shall copy that. And here I'll just create a private constant. I'll call this API token. Okay, so excuse the fact that it's sort of going off the screen now. It's because I have my font quite big in order to record. It just makes it a better experience for the viewers. So next, what what we're going to need to do is actually we're going to create the client differently, and off that client we should be able to go through the container and get a Doctrine Entity Manager, and we'll do all this in the setup method. And the other things we're going to need is we're going to need a user entity, and we're going to need an API token entity. So private, and this will be, we'll take HTTP client interface, and I'll just call that client. And then we'll do the same for Entity Manager. We'll go with a Doctrine Entity Manager interface, or Entity Manager interface. That's the one that I want, and we'll call that Entity Manager. And so here we shall create our client. So this client equals this create client. We don't need to pass any options. And then this Entity Manager equals this client, get container, and then get Doctrine, and then get manager. And so the first thing I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm just going to actually test that we are getting that entity manager. So I'm just going to dump that out here. In fact, I'll dump them both out, this client and this entity manager, and we'll go and run the tests. Okay, so that looks like that's working, so I'm happy with that. Now we can move on to actually creating a user entity and a API token entity. And by the way, if you'd like to learn more about testing PHP, then you'll probably love my course, which is called Testing PHP, and it covers loads of different strategies and techniques for testing this stuff, which is essential if you want to take your testing to the next level. User equals new user, and so that comes from app entity user. Here's the rest of the use statements just in case you didn't quite catch those. So the ones that we just pulled in for this recording are this Symfony contracts HTTP client interface, and the other one was Doctrine ORM entity manager interface, and the others hopefully you should have those from the previous recordings. So user, we need to set an email, maybe set a password. And then what I need to do is say this entity manager persist, and so that brings it under the entity manager's management. And then we actually need to flush this before we create our API token, because we need to relate the API token to an already existing user. So we'll say this entity manager flush. Okay, and now we're on to the API token. So we set the user to the user which we just created, and if I remember rightly we only created those properties. Let's go and have a look. So we created token and user. Yeah, we kept it nice and simple, so we didn't do expiry dates or anything like that, but those kind of things would be a good idea. So now we're going this entity manager persist API token, and this entity manager flush. Okay, great stuff. Now what we need to do is actually remove these calls here, static create client, because we've already created our client, and we'll also need to add a third argument to our request. Let's just go and have a look at the signature for this. So 1, 2, 3. The third argument is an array of options, and one of those options being the headers. Okay, so I think this should work. Let's actually just test out this one test on its own. Okay, one test for assertion, so that tells me that that works. All we need to do then is just go through the rest of these and actually update them. So I'll do that behind the scenes. You don't need to watch me do all of these. So a quick walk through these, done the same for each one. As you can see, we've added the third argument there, which includes the headers. Let's have a look at a post request. So the post request, we're already passing some options, and that is the JSON, if you recall. And so what we've done is just added another option inside of that options array, and that being the headers. Also notice we're using this client on all of these as well. So the next one, test update product. As you can see, this client request put, and again we were already passing in some JSON, but we've added another option which is the headers. And then here we've also included the headers on test create invalid product, and then that was the final test. So really we should have one in there to make sure that we're getting an invalid token error or some kind of token error if we don't actually pass any authentication. But let's run these anyway. So vendor bin PHP unit tests. Okay, so we now get 5 tests, 13 assertions. Let's find a nice easy one, and we'll just copy this little put here, put request, because it's only a small test, and we'll adapt this by not passing the correct API token header. So test, we'll say invalid token, and so for the API token we'll just put fake token, and then we want to say assert response status code same. And if you recall, for bad authentication or failed authentication, we went with the 401, and the actual JSON, if you recall, was message and then invalid credentials. And so let's go and run this. Okay, 6 tests, 15 assertions. Let's just change this to no API token or just something else, just to make sure. We should get a failure here because that's not the correct message that we get back. So invalid credentials is the correct one. If we weren't actually passing the API token header, then we will get a message saying no API token, but we're actually passing an incorrect one, in which case we get invalid credentials. So everything is working correctly. Let's end on a green, run them again. 6 tests, 15 assertions. Okay, so great stuff. In the next one, what we're going to do, now that we've got everything into the state we wanted in, is we're going to continue with the security side of things, except authentication is now taken care of. We're next going to look at authorization, i.e. What roles does a user have, what permissions does that user have, and allowing certain users to be able to do certain things that other users won't be allowed to do. Let's now have a look at role-based access control. So this is where we allow access to a particular endpoint, a particular resource, based on who you are, based on what your role is. Okay, and so the first thing that we'll do is we'll actually set it up, then we'll go and try and hit the endpoint, see our failure, see authorization fail, and then what we'll do is we'll do what it takes in order to fix that. So in our product entity on the API resource here, what we'll do is we're going to add a new one. It's something which we've added to the manufacturer already, and it is collection operations. So remember, we have collection operations which you can perform on a collection, or item operations which you can perform on an item. And so what we're going to do here is, thinking about our application, it wouldn't be wise to just let anyone be able to create a product. So what we're going to do is we're going to say you can only actually create a product if you are a admin. So first off, we'll add get, and we're not going to put any filtering on there. We're not going to specify that you need to be a particular role in order to get the products. We can just leave that how it is. For post operations, i.e. in order to create a product we're saying that you must be an admin, and so the syntax that we use is this: post, then an array. The key is security. That's very important. It's essential that you use that key, and then it's going to be a function called isGranted, and there is a naming convention, and it starts with the word role, all uppercase, and then underscore, and then the role which the user has. So here we are saying role admin, and then closing quotes and then closing parentheses. So just make sure that you get the syntax right there. And what we'll do is we're not going to go and add any roles to any users just yet. We'll go straight over to Postman and we'll give this a try. So if you remember what we said about get requests, you don't need to be an admin to get these, so this should work okay. Just fire off the request there. Okay, no problem. So here we get some products back. However, for creating a post, we're going to send off a post request. So just like before, you need all your headers in place, you need your API token, make sure you've got that, and then you need to create a body. So the details you will need are NPN, name, description, issue date and manufacturer. Make sure you have everything in place first, and then we're just going to fire off this request. Okay, so the thing to note here is this: status 403 forbidden. Let's just hover over that and see what this says. The request was a legal request, but the server is refusing to respond to it. Unlike a 401 unauthorized response, authenticating will make no difference. Basically, we have authenticated, however, we're not able to hit that endpoint. We're not able to get the data back because we don't have the authorization, not the authentication. And so the question is, how do you get authorization? If you're familiar with Symfony, you probably already know the answer to this, but here's how roles works. By default, every user has the role of role user. Let's go over to the user entity and just see what that means. And so when it goes to check the user's roles, which is what happens here, it goes and looks and it calls this method get roles, and then it immediately adds role user to the user's role. So every user in the system, when you go to retrieve the user, whenever the get roles method is called, which is what it's called behind the scenes when we're using role-based access control like we are here, then that role is added. So what we need to do is actually give the user the role admin. So let's go over to Table Plus and we'll have a look at our user. And so this is the user in question. If we look at our API token, we're looking at user ID 1. So that is the user. And so we need to add the role admin for this user. And so we can simply do that just by making sure that we spell it exactly the same way as what we've done in our Symfony application. So role admin. Okay. And then if I save that, and if we go back to Table Plus, our users should now have the role admin, and this should go through and we should be able to create that product. Let's see if this works. Okay, so now we have a status of 201 created, and then as you can see, it's brought back some of the properties that we set here. Everything has worked, and we're now able to protect endpoints by specifying that the user should have a certain role. So things to note here. Mainly the naming convention. When you're using roles, it must begin with role underscore, and then whatever is the name of the role that you are giving to that particular role. And as you saw, very simple to implement. All you need to do is just say security, and then it is granted, and then whatever role the user must have in order to be able to perform that operation. So that takes care of roles. What we'll look at in the next one is we'll actually look at permissions, and maybe we'll look at things called voters. And so instead of saying what role the user has, we can actually get a bit more fine-grained and give different permissions to the user based on maybe what their relationship is to the resources and all kinds of different things like that. Look forward to that one. I'm now going to have a look at authorizing a different way, and this will be more permissions based. So where we've looked at roles, i.e. what role does the user have, now we're going to look at what permissions, what is that user allowed to do. And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to use the old classic. We're going to look at our product here, and we're actually going to give this a concept of ownership. So we're going to be able to link a user to a product as the owner, and then we'll have a permissions rule in there which only allows you to update the product if you are the owner of that product, i.e. if you were the user which initially created it. So how will we approach this? The first thing we need to do is we need to actually go and create that relationship, and there's an easy way that we can do this, and we'll use the maker bundle like we've done to create entities in the past. So if I say php bin console, and I'm going to say make entity, because if I want to update an existing entity, still go about it the same way. So we'll say make entity, and then when it asks you for the entity's name, which it will do here, I'm going to say product, and then that way what we do is we actually update an existing entity instead of creating a new one. So it's now asking me the new property name, and that will be owner. Field type will be a relation. What class should this entity be related to? That will be a user. And then it asks you the relation type. So we need to think of this from the viewpoint of the product, and there will be many products to one user. So one user will have many products, but a product will only ever belong to one user. So hopefully that makes sense, in which case we are looking at a many to one. Is the product owner property allowed to be null? I'm going to say yes, because we already have some products in the database, so I don't want things to explode on us. Let's just keep this simple and keep the wheels moving. So I'll hit enter there. Do you want to add a new property to user so that you can access update product objects from it, e.g. user get products? That would be handy. A handy thing to have, so if you wanted to get all the products for a particular user. However, for these recordings we're not actually going to use it, so I'm not going to demonstrate it. And why add code which we're not going to use? I'm just going to say no. Add another property. No, we don't need to do that, that's all we needed to do. So I'm just going to hit enter, and that will take us out of there. Just getting a message there regarding some deprecations. If you get those, just ignore those, they're not really important to us. As you can see, we've now been created a new property on our products, on our product entity, and it is a many to one, and the target entity is user. So what we want to do now is actually create a migration for this. PHP bin console, and the command you are looking for is doctrine migrations, and it will be diff. And so this will look at the database, look at this entity here, see what the differences are between the two, and reconcile those in the form of a migration file. So are you sure you wish to continue? Yes, I am. Okay, so we've now got a new migration file, which is this one here. Let's just go and have a quick glance at it and make sure that we are happy with it. Alter table product, add owner ID int default. Alter table product, add constraint fk blah blah blah. Foreign key owner ID references user ID. So our owner, we should have an owner ID field on this products table, which references the ID field on the users table. Let's go and actually migrate this. So PHP bin console doctrine migrations migrate. It'll ask you if you are sure. Yes, we are sure. Before we go any further, what I'd like to do is just add our product read and product write groups to this. So in fact, I'll just copy this bit, I'll paste that there, and then we'll just get rid of that assert not null, because we've said that this can be null. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just going to set this owner ID here on product ID 6 to number 1, save that, and then we need to add a rule to our product which says that I cannot update a particular product unless it is a owner of that product. Here we'll add an item operation, or we'll add a couple of item operations, and so that will be get, which we shall just leave as plain old get, like so. And then the next one's going to be a little bit more complex, so this will be put, and then again, like we did when we said is granted role admin, we need security. And so we'll do the same thing again here, so it will be a little bit more lax with this. We'll just say role user, and if you remember what we said about that, every user in the system has the role of role user. So really just making sure that there is an authenticated user making this request. And then this is where things get interesting. We need to check that the owner of the product that we're updating is the actual authenticated user. The way we do it is like this. We have access to a special token thing here called object, and so that refers to the actual object that you're performing the operations on, which in our case will be product item number 6, and then it will be get owner equals, and then again we have access to something else, another special item, and that is user, and this time that means the authenticated user. So let's go over to Postman and we'll actually try this out. So here we're making a put request, and this is going to API products 6, so we'll just perform the operation on a single item. Our headers, so our token is set to our user number 1, which is the user which is down as the owner of this product. And for the body, we're just going to say a new description. Let's fire this off. OK, and it's come back with a status of OK, and it's saying that the description is a new description. Let's go over to the database, give this a refresh, and as you can see there, the description has changed to a new description. OK, perfect. So what we really need to do is actually change the owner to number 2. Make sure that we have an API token for user 2, so we'll say 1, ID number 2, user ID will be user number 2, and so we'll just put in some gibberish there as the API token. So this time we're still going to be making the request as user number 1, except we've said that the product is owned by user number 2, so hopefully we should see an authorization fail here. Again, we'll change this to another new description. I'll hit send. OK, that's good. 403 forbidden access denied. Now there is a way where you can actually make the message a little bit more explicit and explain a little bit more about what's going on. And the way you do that is after where you're performing the security check, you can then add a key called security message. And so we'll say a product can only be updated by the owner. Let's go and fire this off again. And so this time we get a little bit more information in the description. A product can only be updated by the owner. And so that takes care of that. Let's have a little recap on what we did there. We created the concept of an owner, and we added an owner property to our product entity. We related that to a user class, so now we could say that a particular user is the owner of the product, i.e. they created it, and using that we were then able to specify some permissions, and we said that you could only update the product if you were the owner of it. And all very simple. All we needed to do was just add an item operation here, do a similar kind of thing as what we did when we did roles. So here we're just checking if it is an authorized user by saying is granted role user, and then we said is the owner of the object the same as the authenticated user. All fairly straightforward and nice and easy to implement. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the notification icon. Each week I release a number of new recordings. If you'd like to be informed about my upcoming videos as well as receive exclusive content, discounts and early access to my new videos, you can join my mailing list by following the link underneath this video.